somewhere near the middle of the South American continent, under a sky that spent most of its hours quietly rearranging the same soft towers of cloud, there lay a forest so wide that the word forest never quite managed to hold it. It covered parts of 9 countries and more than 2 million square miles, and from above it looked less like a collection of trees than like a single green weather system that had settled onto the land and decided to stay. Through the middle of it ran a river that gathered the rain of half a continent and carried it slowly east toward the Atlantic, and along that river and above it. And beneath it, and in the flooded shadows at its edges, there lived more kinds of living things than anyone had ever finished counting. This is a collection of 100 quiet facts about that forest and that river, gathered slowly and told slowly, with nothing at all required of the listener except the willingness to drift. There is no story to follow here, and no thread that must be held, no names to remember, and no ending waiting at the far side. Each fact stands on its own like a stone in a shallow stream, and if attention slips away between one and the next, nothing is lost, because the forest went on exactly as it was, whether it was being watched or not. The voice will stay level, the pace will stay slow. The facts will move from the river to the canopy, from the flooded woods to the sounds of the night, from the creatures that hunted in silence to the people who had lived among them for thousands of years. And by the end, if the end is ever reached, the listener will most likely be asleep, which was always the point. So the lamp can be turned low now, and the breathing can be allowed to lengthen. And the first of the 100 facts can begin, out on the water, where the whole enormous system finally emptied itself into the sea. The first fact concerned the sheer, almost unreasonable quantity of water that the Amazon carried. At its mouth, the river discharged something on the order of 209,000 cubic meters every second, a figure so large that it resisted being pictured, and which meant in practice that the Amazon delivered roughly 1/5 of all the fresh water that the world's rivers gave to the world's oceans. It carried more water than the next 6 or 7 largest rivers on the planet put together, and it did so without hurry, without drama, moving at the pace of a slow walk across most of its length. The scale showed itself in odd, small ways. A single day of the river's flow would have been enough to supply a great city for years. The water that passed a given tree on a given quiet afternoon had fallen as rain on the flank of the Andes, or on a plateau in Colombia, or on a hill in Bolivia weeks or months before, and had been passed from stream to creek to tributary to river without once being asked to hurry. There was no waterfall on the lower river, no cataract, no gorge that forced it to leap. It simply widened and deepened and went on widening until the 2 banks stood so far apart that a person on one shore could not make out the trees on the other, and the river had stopped resembling a river and had begun to resemble a moving lake with a current in it, endlessly patient, endlessly full. The second fact followed naturally from the first and concerned what happened when all that fresh water finally reached the salt. The Amazon did not simply meet the Atlantic and dissolve into it. It pushed. The plume of river water that emerged from the mouth was so vast and so buoyant, fresh water being lighter than salt, that it floated out across the ocean surface as a distinct layer. A great pale tongue that could be traced for 100 miles offshore and sometimes very much farther, drifting north and west with the currents until it had smeared itself along the coast of the Guianas and, in some seasons, out toward the Caribbean. Sailors in the old accounts had written of drawing up buckets of drinkable water while still out of sight of land. And though the story had a whiff of legend about it, the underlying phenomenon was real enough. The plume carried more than water. It carried silt and dissolved nutrients and organic matter from the whole basin, and where it spread, it fertilized the sea, feeding blooms of microscopic plants that in turn fed everything above them. Beneath the plume, a discovery that surprised even the scientists who made it, there lay a reef system hundreds of miles long, living in the dim, sediment-shadowed water where no one had thought a reef could possibly exist. The river, in other words, did not end at the coastline. It went on being the Amazon for a long while yet, out under the open sky of the ocean, growing gradually thinner and saltier until at last it forgot itself. The third fact was one that visitors often found the hardest to believe, and it was this. Along the entire main stem of the Amazon, from the place where it took that name to the sea, there was not a single bridge. Thousands of miles of river carrying the traffic of a continent, and nothing crossed it. The reason was partly engineering and partly geography, and mostly simple sense. The river was in places 30 miles wide in flood. Its banks were soft alluvium that shifted from year to year. Its channel wandered, and its islands appeared and vanished on a scale of decades. Anything built to span it would have needed foundations sunk into mud that had no intention of staying still. But the deeper reason was that no one particularly needed a bridge, because the river was not an obstacle to the people who lived along it. It was the road. Everything moved by boat, from school children to freight to hospital patients to the crates of oranges and farina that filled the decks of the passenger vessels. A bridge would have crossed the highway rather than continued it. There were bridges on the tributaries, including a long and handsome one over the Rio Negro near Manaus, but the great river itself remained uncrossed by anything but hulls, and the water beneath the hulls remained, as it had always been, the thing that joined the region together rather than the thing that divided it. The fourth fact belonged to a place just downstream of Manaus, where two enormous rivers met and then, for several miles, politely declined to mix. The Rio Negro arrived from the north, and its water was the color of strong tea held up to a lamp, so dark that in a glass it looked almost black. The Solomos arrived from the west, and its water was the pale, opaque brown of milky coffee, thick with the ground stone of the Andes. Where they came together, the two flows ran side by side down the same channel, with a seam between them as sharply drawn as if it had been ruled, black on the right, fawn on the left, the boundary wavering and interlocking in slow scallops but never blurring away. The line held for 4 miles, and sometimes for 6, before the rivers finally consented to become one. The reason was a matter of physics rather than temperament. The two waters differed in temperature by several degrees, differed in density because of the sediment one of them carried, and differed in speed, the Solomos moving noticeably faster. Water of unlike density and unlike velocity does not blend on contact. It requires turbulence, and turbulence takes distance. So the seam persisted, drifting eastward, dark and pale together, until enough tumbling had occurred to make the argument moot, and the Amazon proper went on toward the sea in a single uniform brown. The fifth fact explained the darkness of that first water. The Rio Negro drained an ancient, deeply weathered landscape of white sand and old rock, a country so long rained upon that almost everything soluble had already been washed out of it. Soils like that hold very little for plants, and the vegetation growing there had evolved to defend its leaves fiercely, loading them with tannins and phenols and other bitter compounds that made them unappetizing to insects and slow to rot. When those leaves fell and lay in the shallow standing water of the forest floor, the compounds leached out, and the water took them up, and the result was a dilute cold infusion of the whole forest, chemically not so very different from tea. That water was acidic, sometimes as sour as vinegar diluted many times over, and it was almost sterile in the sense that mosquitoes bred poorly in it. Which is why the Blackwater rivers had a reputation among travelers as the merciful ones. Held in the hand, it was clear, faintly amber, perfectly transparent. Held in the mass of a river a mile wide and many meters deep, it was black, and it took the reflection of the sky so completely that a canoe on the Negro at evening seemed to be floating on a second inverted heaven, with clouds beneath the paddle and the dark line of the forest doubled at the horizon. The sixth fact explained the paleness of the other water, and to explain it one had to leave the lowlands altogether and go west and up into the Andes, where the story of the Amazon actually began. There, on cold slopes above the tree line, ice and frost and running water worked continuously on rock, grinding it into a flour so fine that it stayed suspended in the current instead of settling. Every stream that came down off those mountains carried a load of that pale ground stone, and the streams joined into rivers, and the rivers ran eastward for 1,000 miles and more, without ever slowing enough to drop what they carried. By the time the Solomos reached the meeting place near Manaus, it was carrying an astonishing burden of sediment, hundreds of millions of tons a year, which was why its water was opaque and why a hand dipped in it disappeared at the wrist. That mud was not a defect. It was fertilizer. Wherever the pale water flooded, it laid down a fresh coat of Andean minerals on the land, and those floodplains were the richest ground in the whole basin, capable of growing crops year after year in a region where the upland soils were famously poor. The forest along the Black Rivers was old and hungry and slow. The forest along the Pale Rivers was fed every single year by mountains it would never see. The seventh fact reached much further back, into a past measured in tens of millions of years, and concerned the direction in which the river had once run, long before there was an Amazon in the modern sense. The drainage of that part of the continent flowed the other way, westward, toward the Pacific. Then the Nazca Plate began to grind beneath South America, and the Andes started to rise, and the rising mountains stood squarely across the old outlet like a wall built at the end of a hallway. The water had nowhere to go. For millions of years, the interior of the continent held an enormous system of lakes and wetlands, shallow and warm and slowly filling, pressed against the new mountains on one side and against ancient highlands of hard rock on the other. Only later, as the water rose and the barriers between the old shields were breached, did the whole system tip east and cut a way through to the Atlantic, reversing the flow of a continent's rain. Traces of that vanished inland sea remained in odd and lovely places. There were stingrays in the Amazon, and dolphins, and certain fish with unmistakably marine ancestry, all of them descendants of animals that had been caught in the interior when the water changed its mind. The pink dolphins swimming in the flooded forest were, in a sense, sailors of a sea that had drained away before there were any human beings at all to notice. The eighth fact concerned the great annual breath of the river, the rise and fall that governed almost everything else. The Amazon did not stay at one level. It swelled through the wet months and shrank through the dry, and at Manaus, the difference between the highest water of the year and the lowest averaged around 30 feet, with extremes considerably greater. 30 feet was not a flood in the sense of a disaster. It was a season as regular as winter, and everything in the basin was arranged around it. Houses stood on stilts or floated outright on rafts of hardwood logs, rising and settling with the water like boats at a mooring. Farmers planted quick crops on the fresh mud of the falling river and harvested them before the water came back. Cattle were moved to high ground or onto floating pens. Steps that led down to a landing in September stood entirely submerged in May. And the same landing might be reached by a plank walkway 100 yards long across drowned garden ground. The rise was not sudden. It came at the pace of an inch or two a day for months, so that a person could watch a particular route or a particular fence post disappear over the course of a week and think very little of it. The river was breathing in. In a few months, it would breathe out again, and the mud would come back, and the whole arrangement would be repeated. The ninth fact concerned a rarer and much noisier phenomenon, which arrived near the river's mouth on certain days of the year and was called the pororoca. When the spring tides ran highest, usually near the equinoxes, the incoming Atlantic pushed into the shallow funnel-shaped mouths of the river with enough force to overcome the outgoing current, and the tide did not merely creep in. It formed a wall. A breaking wave several feet high, sometimes as much as 12, traveled upstream against the flow at the speed of a running horse, and behind it came a churning train of smaller waves, and behind those came a sustained surge that could push salt water tens of miles inland. The wave took trees off the bank as it went and remade the shoals, and made a low, continuous roar that could be heard some while before it arrived, which was how it got its name from a word in the old coastal language meaning a great destructive noise. Fishermen learned the timeable of it as thoroughly as any tide table and simply kept out of the way, mooring their boats in side channels until the water had done what it intended. Surfers eventually discovered it and made long, absurd, magnificent rides of many minutes, but the pororoca had been rolling upriver on its own schedule for a very long time before anyone thought to stand on it. The 10th fact concerned depth, and it went some way to explaining why a river with no bridges also had a shipping industry. The Amazon was deep. Along much of its lower course, it ran to well over 100 feet, and in certain scoured stretches the sounding line went past 300, which was enough water to float almost anything afloat. The practical consequence was remarkable. Ocean-going vessels, real sea-going ships of considerable draught, could sail from the Atlantic all the way to Iquitos in Peru, some 2,300 miles inland, and dock at a river port in the foothills of a continent, having never once passed through a lock or waited on a lift. Manaus, 1,000 miles from the sea, had a floating harbor built to rise and fall with the annual flood, and freighters lay against it as they might against a wharf in Hamburg or Rotterdam. To stand on the bank at dusk and see the lit superstructure of a cargo ship move silently past the tops of the flooded trees, with parrots going over and the smell of wet leaves in the air, was to feel two entirely different worlds sliding past each other without either one taking much notice, which was a common enough sensation along that river. The 11th fact concerned the branching of the thing, the way the Amazon was not really one river at all, but a tree of rivers laid flat across a continent. Something in the region of 1,100 tributaries fed it, and of those, 17 were more than 1,000 miles long, which meant that 17 of the Amazon's mere side streams would each have ranked among the great rivers of any other continent. The Madeira alone carried more water than the Mississippi. The Rio Negro, the Japura, the Purus, the Jurua, the Xingu, the Tapajos, the Ucayali, the Maranon, the Putumayo, the Tocantins, all of them were rivers with their own weather, their own fish, their own peoples, their own histories of boats and misunderstandings, and all of them were, from the point of view of a map, minor features. The pattern was fractal in the way that living systems often are. Each of those great tributaries had its own tributaries, and those had creeks. And the creeks had trickles that ran clear over leaf litter and could be stepped across without wetting the ankle, and every one of those trickles was, technically and truthfully, the Amazon. Rain that fell on a mossy stone in the Ecuadorian foothills and rain that fell on a sand ridge in Guyana were both, in the end, headed for the same estuary, by different roads at different speeds, and would arrive weeks or months apart, having never once been in the same place until the last. The 12th fact concerned the question of where such a river could be said to begin, which turned out to be less a matter of geography than of definition and stubbornness. For centuries, the accepted source lay in southern Peru, on the slopes of a peak called Nevado Mismi, where a small stream of snowmelt gathered in a rock gully at around 18,000 feet and set off downhill as the Apurimac. Later expeditions, armed with satellite measurement and a determination to settle the matter, argued for a different headwater on the Montero, which by some reckonings added dozens of miles to the total length. The dispute mattered mostly because of an old rivalry over which river on earth was the longest, the Amazon or the Nile. And the answer shifted depending on which mouth one measured to and which trickle one credited at the top. What was not in dispute was the strangeness of the picture itself, that a river which ended 4,000 miles away in a mouth wide enough to swallow a small country began as a thread of cold water no wider than a hand, seeping out of wet gravel in a treeless place where the air was thin and where no leaf of the rainforest could possibly have survived a single night. The 13th fact concerned an animal that had no business being where it was and yet had been there for millions of years. The boto, the Amazon River dolphin, lived its entire life in fresh water, hundreds and often thousands of miles from any sea. It was pink, or rather it became pink with age, the color deepening as the skin thinned and scarred over a long life, so that an old male might be the shade of a faded rose while a youngster was still the gray of wet slate. It had almost none of the streamlined rigidity of its ocean cousins. Its neck vertebrae were unfused, which meant that it could turn its head to look sideways, an ability that no marine dolphin possessed and which mattered enormously in a world of trunks and roots and drowned branches. Its flippers were broad and paddle-like for slow maneuvering, its snout long and studded with different kinds of teeth, some for gripping and some for crushing the armored catfish and river turtles it hunted. In the high water season, it left the channel entirely and swam among the trees, threading its way through the flooded forest at what would have been canopy height in another season, hunting fish in the branches. Very little in the natural world was quite so quietly improbable as a dolphin moving through a wood. The 14th fact concerned another mammal of that water, slower and far more retiring. The Amazonian manatee was the only manatee that never entered the sea. A great gray rounded animal weighing up to half a ton, with a face like a benign and wrinkled cushion and a habit of grazing on floating meadows of grass with a steady, dedicated absorption. It ate a prodigious quantity of vegetation, tens of kilograms a day in the season of plenty. And it did so with lips that worked independently like a pair of soft hands. In the dry season, when the floating meadows stranded and rotted and the lakes shrank, it faced a hungry stretch of months, and it dealt with this by simply not eating very much at all, dropping its metabolism, living off its own reserves, and lying up in the deeper pools in a state close to fasting until the water came back. Its whole existence had the pace of the river itself. It rose to breathe with almost no sound, showing a small gray curve and a pair of nostrils, and was gone again, and the ripple spread and flattened, and unless one had been watching that exact patch of water, there was nothing to suggest that anything had happened at all. The 15th fact concerned the mud and the sheer weight of it. Every year the Amazon carried somewhere between 1 billion and 1.25 billion tons of sediment out of the Andes and delivered it to the Atlantic, which was one of the largest continuous movements of solid material anywhere on the surface of the planet. That figure was difficult to hold in mind, so it helped to think of it in terms of what it built. The sediment had constructed the entire lower floodplain, hundreds of miles wide in places, layer upon layer of Andean silt spread across ancient rock. It had built the vast island of Marajo at the river's mouth, an island roughly the size of Switzerland, made almost entirely of material that had once been mountain. Offshore, the current smeared the load north along the coast, where it fed the enormous mud banks of the Guianas, great migrating shoals of soft sediment that traveled slowly up the shoreline over decades and reshaped the coasts of 3 countries as they went. The Andes, in other words, were being disassembled grain by grain and reassembled 2,000 miles away as flat, wet country, and the river was doing it silently, continuously, without any visible effort, the way it did everything else. The 16th fact concerned the fish, and the number was startling. More than 2,300 species of fish had been described from the Amazon basin, and the true figure was widely thought to be well over 3,000, with new ones still being named at a rate of several dozen a year. That was more species of fish than lived in the whole of the Atlantic Ocean. A single lake off the main channel might hold more kinds of fish than an entire European river system. They range from the arapaima, longer than a man is tall, to catfish so small and so translucent that they lived their lives inside the gill cavities of larger fish, to species that ate nothing but seeds or nothing but fins nipped from other fish, or nothing but the wood of drowned trees, which they rasped and digested with the help of gut microbes in the manner of a termite. The diversity had been built by the landscape itself, by millions of years of rivers changing course, isolating populations in cut-off lakes, then reconnecting them in flood, then isolating them again, a slow shuffling of the deck repeated across an area the size of a continent until the number of hands dealt became almost uncountable. The 17th fact concerned the largest of those fish and its peculiar necessity. The arapaima, called piraruchu along much of the river, grew to 3 meters and more and to a weight approaching 200 kilograms, armored in scales so tough that people had long used them as nail files and as decoration. What made it remarkable was not the size, but the breathing. The arapaima possessed a modified swim bladder lined with tissue that functioned as a primitive lung. And it was an obligate air breather, meaning that it had to come to the surface roughly every 10 or 20 minutes to gulp, or it would drown in its own river. This was not a flaw. It was an adaptation to water that was often nearly devoid of oxygen. Warm and stagnant and choked with decaying vegetation in the season when the floods lay still among the trees. In such water most fish struggled, and the arapaima simply rose, took a mouthful of the air that everything else was competing for underneath, and sank again with a heavy, unhurried roll and a sound like a small door closing. In the quiet of a backwater at dusk, that sound came at intervals from various parts of the lake, and it was one of the most characteristic noises of the whole basin. The 18th fact concerned a journey. Certain large catfish of the Amazon, among them the golden dorada, undertook what was probably the longest freshwater migration made by any animal on Earth. They spawned in the clear headwater streams at the foot of the Andes, and the larvae drifted downstream with the current for thousands of miles, growing as they went until they reached the nursery grounds of the estuary near the Atlantic. There the young fish fed and matured for several years in the brackish, food-rich water of the river's mouth. And then, as adults, they turned around and swam the entire length of the river back to the mountains to spawn where they had been spawned, a round trip of something on the order of 11,000 kilometers, accomplished entirely in fresh water, entirely against or with a current that never stopped, without any coastline to follow or any landmark of the kind that guides birds. How they navigated remained imperfectly understood. That they did it was beyond doubt, because they were caught at both ends by fishermen who had never met and who spoke different languages and who were, without knowing it, harvesting the same animals at opposite stages of a single enormous circle. The 19th fact concerned a reputation that had been badly overstated. Piranhas existed, and there were dozens of species of them, and their teeth were genuinely impressive, triangular and interlocking and replaced throughout life. But the image of the boiling water and a skeleton stripped in seconds was largely a piece of theater, popularized by a former president of the United States who had been shown a staged demonstration by hosts eager to impress him with the ferocity of their country. In reality, most piranha species ate fruit, seeds, insects, and the fins and scales of other fish, and many were primarily scavengers that performed a useful sanitary function in the shallows. They shoaled not to attack, but for protection, since a great many larger things ate them. Attacks on people occurred, but almost always in the dry season, when falling water concentrated hungry fish into shrinking pools, and almost always as a single defensive nip rather than a frenzy. For most of the year, in most of the river, people swam and bathed and washed their cooking pots in water full of piranhas without giving the matter a second thought, which was itself a fact worth holding on to at the end of a long day. The 20th fact concerned a creature that had genuinely earned its reputation, though not for teeth. The electric eel was not an eel at all, but a knife fish, a long cylindrical animal that breathed air like the arapaima and that carried, along most of its body length, 3 separate organs made of thousands of stacked cells called electrocytes, each one a tiny biological battery. Discharged together, these could deliver a shock measured at up to 860 volts in the strongest species recorded, enough to drop a horse, though the current was brief and the danger to a healthy adult lay more in being stunned in deep water than in the shock itself. The eel used low-voltage pulses constantly as a kind of radar, mapping its surroundings in the muddy, lightless water where eyes were nearly useless, and reserved the high-voltage discharge for hunting and defense. It could also, remarkably, curl its body to bring head and tail together and so concentrate the field on a single prey item, and it could make its victim's muscles twitch involuntarily, forcing a hidden fish to reveal itself. All of this happened silently, invisibly, in water that looked exactly like any other water, which was a reasonable summary of a great deal of what went on in that river. The 21st fact introduced a distinction that governed a great deal of life in the basin, which was that there was not one flooded forest, but two, and they were not alike. Where the pale sediment-rich rivers overflowed their banks, the drowned woodland was called Varzea, and it was a place of astonishing fertility, refreshed every single year with a new coating of Andean mineral, growing fast, growing tall, dropping heavy fruit, crowded with fish and birds and with people who had farmed its mud for centuries. Where the black, acidic, nutrient-poor rivers overflowed, the drowned woodland was called Igapo, and it was another country altogether, slower, sparser, quieter, its trees smaller and tougher and more heavily defended, its water like dark glass, its floor bare of the rich litter that fed the pale water forests. A person could travel from one to the other in a single morning and feel the change without being able at first to name it. The Varzea hummed, the Igapo hushed. Together they covered an area larger than many nations, and together they carried out the same essential trick, which was to be a forest for half the year and a lake for the other half, and to be entirely at ease in both conditions. The 22nd fact concerned how the trees managed it, standing in still water for 4, 5, sometimes 7 months of the year would kill almost any tree in the temperate world within weeks, because roots need oxygen and drowned soil has almost none. The trees of the flooded forest had arrived at several solutions and used them in combination. Many simply shut down, dropping their leaves as the water rose and entering a dormancy much like the winter dormancy of a birch in a cold country, waiting out the flood as a bare skeleton and leafing out again when the water fell. Others grew special surface roots that spread horizontally just under the water film, or produced spongy aerating tissue that let air travel down from the trunk. Some tolerated the alcohol that their own roots produced when starved of oxygen, a metabolic path that would have poisoned other species. Growth rings in the wood of those trees recorded not summers and winters, but floods and drynesses, and could be counted in exactly the same way, so that a single trunk held a legible record of a century of the river's moods, written in the only language a tree can write in. The 23rd fact concerned who ate the fruit. In most forests, fruit falls to the ground and is carried away by mammals and birds. In the flooded forest, for months at a time, there was no ground. What lay beneath the branches was 6 or 8 meters of brown water, and so the fruit fell into that water, and it was fish that came for it. The tambaqui, a deep-bodied silver fish that could weigh 30 kilograms, had molar-like teeth strong enough to crack the hard shells of rubber tree seeds and palm nuts, and it cruised beneath the fruiting crowns, waiting for the sound of something dropping. Dozens of species did the same, browsing the drowned understory, mouthing seeds from the surface film, and then swimming off with their cargo and depositing it, hours later and kilometers away. in perfectly good condition to germinate when the water fell. So a substantial share of the trees in one of the world's great forests depended for their reproduction on fish, which is a sentence that takes a moment to settle. The forest was planted in large measure by animals that had never touched the earth. The 24th fact followed from that arrangement and concerned timing. If a tree's seeds were to be dispersed by fish, then the tree had to fruit, while the fish were up in the branches, which meant fruiting at high water. And so a great many species of the Varzea and Agapo had their entire reproductive calendar keyed not to temperature, which barely varied, and not to daylight, which barely varied either, but to the flood. They flowered as the water began to climb, and their fruit ripened and dropped in the weeks when the river stood highest among their limbs, and then they rested. The synchronization was remarkably precise, and it had knock-on effects through the whole system. The fish fattened enormously in those months, laying down the reserves that would carry them through the lean dry season and fuel their spawning runs, and the people who fished them knew that a tambaki taken at the end of high water was a different and far richer animal than the same fish taken in. October. Everything from the flowering of a tree to the fat on a fish to the price of a market stall in a river town was ultimately being run by the depth of the water. The 25th fact concerned what it was actually like to be there when the water stood high. A fisherman would pole a canoe not along a channel but into the forest itself, in among the trunks, moving where in another season he would have been walking. Overhead there were leaves and epiphytes and the ordinary business of the canopy, and underneath the hull, 4 or 5 meters down, invisible in the brown, was the forest floor with its fallen logs and its termite mounds and its trails. Sunlight came through the leaves and fell in coins on water instead of on earth. Birds moved through branches at eye level. Occasionally the canoe brushed a liana and set the whole green rigging of it swaying. The paddling was quiet because there was no current in there, the water having spread out and gone still, and the sound was mostly drips and the small ticking of insects and the clean knock of the paddle against the gunwale. It was one of the strangest and gentlest experiences available anywhere on earth to be adrift in the middle level of a wood, and it lasted for months and then simply ended, and the same man walked the same route on foot with his dog and thought nothing of it. The 26th fact concerned the floating meadows, which were among the most productive plant communities anywhere. Certain grasses of the floodplain, chief among them a species with the fitting name of Conarana, grew at extraordinary speed as the water rose, extending their stems upward and outward until whole rafts of interwoven vegetation drifted free of the bottom and traveled the river as mobile islands. Some were the size of a room. Some were the size of a field, complete with shrubs and passengers, and could be seen sailing sedately down the main channel toward the sea with herons standing on them. Beneath their surface hung a dense tangle of roots that provided shelter and food for an entire nursery of young fish and invertebrates, so that a floating meadow was really a small drifting reef. Manatees grazed them from below. Capybaras clambered onto them. Insects and spiders lived out complete lives on a scrap of vegetation that had begun the season attached to a riverbank in Peru. When the water fell, the meadows stranded and dried and rotted and returned their enormous bulk of nutrients to the mud, and the following year they did it again from seed and from stubble, with no memory of anything. The 27th fact concerned a mark that appeared on almost every trunk in the flooded forest, and that could be read like a ruler. As the water lay against the bark for months at a time, it left a stain, a dark tide line where algae and silt and the chemistry of the flood had discolored the surface, and the line was sharp enough to be seen from a boat. Above it, the bark was pale and lichened and belonged to the air. Below it, the bark was darkened and smoothed and belonged to the water. Every tree in the wood carried the same mark at the same height, so that a walk through the dry season forest was a walk beneath a perfectly level line drawn through the trees at 3 or 4 times the height of a person, as if a surveyor had gone through with a very long straight edge. Older trunks carried fainter, earlier lines above and below the fresh one, records of exceptional years. The great floods and the great droughts, so that a patient observer could stand in the shade and read off, in a few minutes, 3 decades of hydrology that no instrument had recorded. The forest kept its own gauge, and it kept it everywhere at once. The 28th fact concerned how people arranged their lives around all that moving water. Along thousands of miles of river, houses stood on hardwood posts driven deep into the bank, with floors set above the height of an ordinary flood and a ladder or a plank to reach them, and in the wet months families moved about their own villages by canoe, tying up to the veranda rail as one might park at a gate. Other households did away with posts entirely and built on rafts of buoyant logs, so that the whole house rose and fell with the river and never flooded at all, and a village of such houses shifted its shape slightly year by year as the moorings were adjusted. Shops floated, and so did schools and fuel stations, and in some places churches. Chickens were kept in raised coops. Dogs learned to walk narrow plankways with great confidence. Everything in such a settlement was designed with the understanding that the ground was a seasonal convenience rather than a fixed fact, and children who grew up there could swim before they could reliably run, and thought a floor that never moved was slightly odd. The 29th fact concerned an event that once turned the sandbanks of the dry season into something close to a spectacle. The giant South American river turtle laid its eggs on exposed beaches, and it did so collectively in numbers that early travelers described in terms that later readers assumed to be exaggeration. Thousands of females came ashore in a few nights on a single bank, digging, laying, covering, and returning to the water, and the eggs were harvested in such quantities in the 18th and 19th centuries that the oil rendered from them lit the lamps of river towns for decades. The populations collapsed under that pressure, and for a long time the great gatherings were memory only. Protection of the nesting beaches, patrolled in many places by the river communities themselves, brought some of them back. And on certain guarded sandbars the sight returned, a beach in motion at dusk, the sand turning over, the low rasp of shells, and then in the small hours nothing but a churned surface and a great many tracks leading down to the water and none leading back up. The 30th fact concerned the other half of the year, when the water withdrew. As the river fell, the flooded forest drained, and the fish that had spent months dispersed among the trees were pulled back with it, and many were left behind in shrinking lakes and pools cut off from the channel. Those pools became, for a few months, the richest hunting grounds in the basin. Egrets and storks and spoonbills stood shoulder to shoulder in the shallows. Caimans lay in the mud with almost nothing to do but wait. Kingfishers worked the edges and vultures the margins, and jaguars came down at night to the drying pans where the fish were thick enough to be taken by hand. It was not cruelty, and it was not chaos. It was simply the annual concentration of a system that had spent the wet season spread thin across 100,000 square kilometers and was now being wrung out into a few thousand puddles. When the rains returned and the river rose, the surviving fish washed back out into the forest, and the birds dispersed, and the whole enormous arrangement inhaled again. The 31st fact turned attention upward and concerned the way the forest was stacked. Naturalists had long described it in 4 layers, and though nature was untidier than any diagram, the description held. At the bottom lay the forest floor, dim and open and surprisingly easy to walk through, carpeted in a thin skin of leaves that decayed almost as fast as they fell. Above that stood the understory, a zone of saplings and small palms and shade-tolerant shrubs, living in permanent grain twilight, still and humid and almost windless. Above that came the canopy proper, a continuous roof of interlocking crowns at 30 to 45 meters, where the overwhelming majority of the forest leaves, flowers, fruit, and animal life were to be found. And above even that stood the emergence, individual giants that had pushed their heads clear of the roof and stood alone in the sun and the wind. Visible from miles away as dark knobs on the horizon of green. Conditions in these 4 layers differed so completely in light and heat and humidity and movement of air that they might have belonged to different countries, and an animal perfectly adapted to one of them could be helpless in another only 20 meters away. The 32nd fact concerned those giants at the top. The kapok, called sumoma along the river, was the classic emergent, a tree that could exceed 60 meters, its trunk smooth and pale and often studded with defensive spines when young, its crown spreading flat and wide like an umbrella held above the general roof of the forest. Standing at the base of one was a curious experience, because the first branch might be 40 meters overhead and the trunk went up like a cathedral column with nothing to give a sense of scale except the flying buttresses at the bottom. Such trees could live for 2 or 3 centuries, and while they lived they served as landmarks, as roosts for harpy eagles and macaws, as anchor points for whole hanging gardens of other plants, and in the traditions of many river peoples as beings entitled to a certain respect. Their seeds traveled in pods full of pale floss, which was the kapok of pillows and life jackets, and when a big tree released them, the air beneath it filled with a slow, silent snow that drifted through the shafts of light for hours and settled on the water in rafts. The 33rd fact concerned darkness. Despite lying almost on the equator, under a sun that stood nearly overhead at noon, the floor of a mature rainforest received only about 1 to 2% of the light that struck the top of the canopy. 98% was intercepted, absorbed, reflected, or scattered by the leaves above, layer on layer, so that what reached the ground was a dim green wash comparable to the light in a room with a single small window. Photographers found it maddening. Plants found it a defining constraint. A seedling on that floor might sit for years in a kind of suspended animation, growing a few centimeters a season, holding on with the patience of something that had no alternative, waiting for the one event that could change its circumstances entirely. Meanwhile, the leaves themselves had adapted to the gloom, growing broad and thin and dark, packed with chlorophyll, arranged in flat mosaics to avoid shading one another, catching what they could. The green of the understory was therefore not a bright green at all, but a deep, saturated, almost liquid color, and it was one of the reasons the forest felt cool and enclosed even at the hottest hour of the day. The 34th fact concerned a phenomenon visible only by lying on one's back and looking straight up, which was well worth doing. The crowns of many canopy trees did not touch. Between one crown and the next there ran a distinct channel of open sky, a few centimeters to a meter wide, tracing the outline of every tree as neatly as a pencil line, so that the roof of the forest looked from below like a jigsaw with the pieces slightly separated. The effect was called crown shyness, and its causes were still argued over. Abrasion was part of it, since in wind the outer twigs of neighboring trees whipped against one another and broke the growing tips, pruning each crown back from its neighbor. Light sensing was probably part of it too, since plants can detect the reflected wavelengths of nearby leaves and steer their growth away. Whatever the mechanism, the result was a delicate network of bright seams running across the ceiling of the world, and it meant that arboreal animals, which could travel enormous distances through the canopy, still had to make small, careful decisions about where to cross from one tree to the next. The 35th fact concerned the strange architecture at the base of the largest trees. Many of the giants stood not on a simple round trunk, but on great thin blades of wood that flared out from the lower stem like the fins of a rocket. 2 or 3 meters high and sometimes extending as far again across the ground, thin enough in places to see light through and to sound like a drum when struck. These were buttress roots, and their purpose was mechanical. In a forest where the soil was shallow and the root plate spread wide rather than deep, a 60-meter tree with a heavy asymmetric crown needed help staying upright. And the buttresses acted as tension braces, transferring the leverage of the wind and the weight of the canopy out to a wide footing. They also created spaces. The bays between buttresses formed sheltered alcoves at the foot of every big tree, dry in the rain and out of the wind, and they were used accordingly by frogs and snakes and spiders, by nesting birds, and by generations of travelers who had discovered that a buttress bay made a serviceable bedroom on a wet night. The 36th fact concerned a paradox that had confused agriculture in the region for centuries. The richest forest on earth grew on some of the poorest soil on earth. Much of the basin's uplands lay on ancient, deeply weathered ground from which rain had long ago washed most of the mineral nutrients, leaving little more than acidic clay and sand. The astonishing biomass overhead was not drawn from that ground. It was held in the living material itself, in the wood and leaves and bodies of the forest, and it was recycled with extraordinary speed and efficiency. A leaf falling to the floor was consumed within weeks. Fine roots formed a dense mat in the top few centimeters of soil and were laced through with fungal partners, mycorrhizae, that reached out through the litter and captured nutrients from decaying material before rain could carry them away, passing them straight back into the tree in exchange for sugars. Almost nothing escaped. The nutrients that built a 100-ton tree had circulated through the same small volume of ground for millennia, and that was precisely why clearing such a forest for farming so often produced 2 decent harvests and then a field of exhausted dust. The 37th fact concerned the passengers. In the canopy of an Amazonian tree there might live 100 or more species of other plants, none of them rooted in soil at all. Orchids, ferns, cacti, aeroids, and above all bromeliads perched on the branches as epiphytes, drawing water from the rain and the mist and nutrients from the dust and detritus that collected around them. The bromeliads were the most consequential. Their leaves overlapped at the base to form a watertight cup, and each cup held anything from a spoonful to several liters of standing water, and each of those little tanks became a self-contained pond suspended 40 meters above the ground. Mosquito larvae lived in them, and so did dragonfly nymphs, flatworms, crabs, salamanders in some regions, and a great many frogs that spent their entire tadpole stage in one plant. A single large canopy tree could hold thousands of liters of water in this way and support an entire aquatic fauna that would never in its life encounter the river. Researchers who first climbed into the canopy and began cataloging what lived there found so much that was new that the layer was called, half seriously, the last unexplored continent. The 38th fact concerned the climbers, which had solved the problem of light by refusing to pay for the scaffolding. Lianas were woody vines that germinated on the forest floor, found a young tree, and rode it upward, investing almost nothing in trunk and everything in length, so that a stem no thicker than a wrist might carry leaves spread across half a hectare of canopy. They looped and coiled and hung in cables between crowns, and they knitted the forest together so thoroughly that a falling tree often dragged 2 or 3 neighbors down with it. The strangler figs went further. A fig seed, deposited by a bird in the fork of a high branch, germinated there as an epiphyte and sent slender roots down the trunk toward the distant ground. Over years those roots thickened and fused into a lattice around the host, and the fig's crown spread above and shaded it out, and eventually the host tree died and rotted, and what remained was a hollow cylinder of interlaced fig roots standing on its own, entirely self-supporting, with an empty column of air at its heart where a tree had once been. The 39th fact concerned what happened when one of the giants finally came down. The fall of an emergent tree was among the loudest events in the forest, and it opened a hole in the canopy that changed everything beneath it. Sunlight poured onto ground that had not felt it in a century. The temperature rose, the humidity dropped, and the seedlings that had been waiting in suspended patience for exactly this moment began to grow at a rate that would have been unbelievable a month earlier, some of them adding several meters in a year. Fast, soft-wooded pioneer species sprang up alongside them from seeds that had lain dormant in the soil for decades, and vines and shrubs surged in. And for a few years, the gap was a bright tangle utterly unlike the shaded hall around it. Then the race resolved. The pioneers grew quickly and died young. The slow hardwoods overtook them. The canopy closed. The light went out. The floor returned to its green twilight, and in 80 or 100 years there was no sign that anything had happened except a slightly different mix of species and a long, low mound where the old trunk had rotted into the ground. The 40th fact concerned the arithmetic of the trees themselves, which turned out to be stranger than anyone expected. Careful analysis of thousands of survey plots suggested that the Amazon held roughly 16,000 tree species, an almost unmanageable diversity, with a single hectare of forest sometimes containing 300 different kinds. And yet the same analysis showed that a mere 227 of those species, 1.5% of the total, accounted for about half of all the individual trees in the entire basin. These were the hyperdominants, common everywhere, the palms and the ubiquitous workhorses of the canopy, while the remaining 15,000 or so species were mostly rare, some of them known from a handful of individuals in a region the size of Europe. The forest was therefore two things at once: an overwhelmingly repetitive place made of the same few dozen familiar trees, and simultaneously a place where a botanist could walk for a day and find a specimen that no botanist had ever collected. Both descriptions were entirely true, and which one a person came away with depended largely on how closely they had been looking. The 41st fact concerned a river that had no banks and no bed and could not be photographed, and which nonetheless carried more water than the Amazon itself. Above the forest, in the moving air, there ran what atmospheric scientists had taken to calling flying rivers, vast invisible corridors of water vapor that streamed westward across the basin, struck the wall of the Andes, and turned south, delivering rain to the farmlands of Bolivia, Paraguay, Argentina, and southern Brazil, thousands of kilometers away. The estimates were staggering. The vapor flux over the Amazon exceeded, in some seasons and by some measures, the liquid discharge of the river below it, which meant that the forest exported water twice, once through its roots and channels and once through its leaves and the sky, and that the second export fed the agriculture of half a continent. Farmers who had never seen a rainforest and never intended to were watering their soy and their cattle pasture with rain that had passed through the leaves of trees a hemisphere's worth of distance away. The corridor was invisible from the ground. From a satellite in the right band of measurement, it showed as a bright ribbon streaming off the green, as legible and as continuous as any river on a map. The 42nd fact concerned where all that vapor came from, and the answer was individual trees doing something quite ordinary. A tree draws water from the soil, sends it up through the wood to the leaves, and there lets a fraction evaporate through microscopic pores in order to keep the flow moving and the leaf cool. The scale of it in the tropics was what astonished. A single large canopy tree might release several hundred liters of water into the air on a hot day, and one very large emergent could push past 1,000. Multiply that by the 400 billion or so trees estimated to stand in the Amazon, and the arithmetic ran away into figures that meant nothing. What it meant on the ground was more modest and more beautiful. It meant that the forest sweated. On a still morning, the air beneath the canopy was saturated to the point where a cold bottle beat it instantly, and paper went limp. And the reason was simply that several 100 million tons of water were being quietly exhaled overhead into an atmosphere that had nowhere convenient to put it. The 43rd fact followed directly and concerned recycling. In most parts of the world, rain falls, runs off, reaches the sea, and is done. Over the Amazon, a raindrop was likely to be used repeatedly. Isotope studies of rainwater across the basin suggested that a given molecule of water arriving from the Atlantic might fall as rain, be taken up by roots, be transpired back into the air, drift further west, fall again, and repeat that cycle 5 or 6 times before finally either reaching the mountains or being carried out of the basin. The consequence was that rainfall in the western Amazon depended heavily on the presence of forest in the eastern Amazon, and that the interior of the continent was wet, not merely because moist air arrived from the ocean, but because the forest kept catching that moisture and throwing it inland again, hand over hand, like a bucket chain. It was one of the few genuinely planet-scale examples of a landscape maintaining its own climate, and it meant that the forest and the rain were not two things, one of which caused the other, but a single circular arrangement in which each was continuously producing the other. The 44th fact concerned the fine detail of how that rain actually formed, and it involved the forest even more intimately than transpiration did. A cloud droplet cannot condense out of clear air unaided. It needs a nucleus, a speck of something for the water to gather on. Over the ocean, that speck is usually sea salt. Over most land, it is usually dust or pollution. Over the Amazon, in the wet season, the air was so clean that scientists compared it to pre-industrial conditions, and the specks were biological, fungal spores, pollen grains, fragments of leaves, bacteria, and the sticky organic vapors released by the plants themselves, which reacted in sunlight to form fine particles. The forest, in other words, was seeding its own clouds, exhaling not only water, but the very motes on which that water would condense. Rain in that basin was therefore made almost entirely out of the forest twice over, and the phrase that researchers used for it, biological precipitation, was accurate in a way that felt almost impolite in its simplicity. The 45th fact concerned an unlikely supply line stretching across an ocean. The soils of the central Amazon were, as noted, badly leached, and one nutrient in particular, phosphorus, was in chronically short supply and steadily lost downriver. It was replenished remarkably by dust from the Sahara. Every year, storms lifted many millions of tons of fine mineral dust off the desert, and a portion of it, much of that portion originating in one specific ancient lakebed in Chad, whose sediments were rich in the remains of freshwater organisms, was carried west across the Atlantic on the trade winds and fell out over South America. The quantity of phosphorus delivered this way was estimated at tens of thousands of tons annually, roughly balancing what the rivers carried away. A desert on one continent was therefore fertilizing a rainforest on another in a transfer that took about a week to cross the ocean and had been running, in one form or another, for a very long time. Nothing in the arrangement was designed, and nothing about it was obvious from the ground, where the dust arrived invisibly and settled on leaves and was washed down into the soil by the next shower. The 46th fact concerned the smell that preceded rain, which in the Amazon was more pronounced than almost anywhere. Before the first drops arrived, the air changed, taking on a dense, earthy sweetness that people who lived there recognized, without needing to think about it. Part of it was geosmin, a compound produced by soil bacteria and released when moisture disturbs dry ground, detectable by the human nose at concentrations of a few parts per trillion. Which is to say that people are more sensitive to the smell of coming rain than sharks are to blood. Part of it was the oils that plants shed onto surfaces during dry weather being lifted into the air by the first impacts, and part of it was ozone brought down from higher altitudes by the downdraught ahead of a storm, sharp and faintly metallic. Together these arrived on a wave of cool air perhaps a minute before the rain itself, so that a person sitting on a step could smell the weather coming and stand and gather in the laundry and be inside with time to spare, having been given warning by chemistry. The 47th fact concerned the mornings, which in much of the basin began under a lid of cloud that the forest had made overnight. In the cool hours, the humid air near the ground condensed, and by first light the river lay under a level layer of white mist a few meters deep, so thick that a canoe crossing it showed only the head and shoulders of the paddler. Above the forest, the same process produced a low sheet of cloud that clung to the canopy and steamed off it in slow columns as the sun rose. From a hilltop or a tower, the sight was extraordinary. A white floor stretching to the horizon with the crowns of the emergent trees standing out of it like islands, absolutely still, gradually dissolving. Within 2 hours it was gone, drawn up into the day's building cumulus, and by noon those clouds had grown into towers, and by mid-afternoon they had turned dark at the base and begun to rain, and much of what fell had been lying on the river as fog at breakfast. The 48th fact concerned a piece of vocabulary that misled almost everyone. The Amazon had a dry season, and in much of the basin it was not dry. It was merely less wet, receiving perhaps 100 millimeters of rain in a month where the wet season delivered 300 or 400, which in most of the world would still have counted as a generous summer. Rivers fell, beaches appeared, roads became passable, and travel became easy. But the forest itself scarcely noticed. In fact, satellite measurements produced a result that puzzled researchers for years. Over large areas, the canopy appeared to grow greener during the dry months rather than browner. Deep-rooted trees, reaching water many meters down, took advantage of the extra sunlight that came with fewer clouds and flushed new leaves precisely when a temperate forest would have been shutting down. The forest's calendar, in other words, was driven by light rather than by water, because water was rarely the limiting factor, and the dry season was less a hardship than an opportunity, which was why so much flowering and fruiting was timed for it. The 49th fact concerned the anatomy of a single afternoon storm, which followed a script so consistent that people set their plans by it. The morning would be bright and rapidly heating. By 11 the cumulus would be piling up, brilliant white, with flat bases all at exactly the same height where the rising air reached its condensation level. Through the early afternoon, those towers would grow until they punched into the high cold air and spread out at the top into the anvil shape that meant the thing was fully grown. Then the base would go blue-black, the wind would drop away entirely for a minute or two, and a cool gust would arrive out of nowhere, carrying leaves and the smell of rain. The line of the downpour could be seen coming across the water like a moving gray curtain with a hard edge, and it arrived with a roar and a drop in temperature of several degrees. 20 minutes to an hour later it was over, the cloud had rained itself out, the sun came back through, and the forest steamed. This happened in the wet months most days, and it was so reliable that it functioned as a clock. The 50th fact concerned quantity and sound. Rainfall across the basin averaged something over 2 meters a year and in the wettest corners, particularly along the Andean foothills where moist air was forced to climb. It exceeded 5 or 6 meters annually, among the highest totals recorded anywhere on Earth. But the number mattered less than the noise. Rain falling on a rainforest canopy did not sound like rain falling on a roof or on a field. It arrived first as a distant hiss, then as a swelling roar in the treetops 30 meters overhead, and only afterwards, delayed and softened and broken up by the leaves, did it reach the ground as a scattered, irregular dripping. A person standing beneath a heavy shower in a mature forest could be almost dry for several minutes while the canopy absorbed and redistributed the storm. And when the rain stopped above, the dripping below continued for a long while afterwards, slowing gradually over half an hour, so that the forest went on quietly raining on itself under a clear sky, which was as pleasant a sound as that continent had to offer. The 51st fact concerned the change of shift, which on the equator happened quickly and at almost the same hour all year round. Because the basin lay so near the middle of the world, the sun rose and set close to 6 o'clock in every month, and it did so steeply, dropping toward the horizon at a right angle rather than sliding along it, which meant that the long golden evenings of higher latitudes simply did not occur. Twilight lasted about 20 minutes. In that 20 minutes, the entire acoustic population of the forest was replaced. The day birds finished, the parrots came over in loud, ragged pairs, heading for their roosts. The last of the cicadas wound down, and then, in a sequence that never varied much, a different orchestra took over from underneath. First came a rising whine from the trees, thin and metallic, the evening cicadas and the earliest katydids. Then, from every low, wet place, the frogs. Then, the crickets, filling in the middle of the register. Within half an hour of the sun going, the volume of the forest had not decreased at all, but had shifted entirely in character, from the intermittent, directional sounds of birds to a continuous, unlocatable wall of insect noise that came from all sides at once and had no edges. People who slept in the forest for the first time often reported that the noise kept them awake, and then reported, a night or two later, that they could no longer hear it because the brain had classified it as weather. The 52nd fact concerned the loudest voice in the whole basin, which belonged to an animal weighing about 7 kilograms. Howler monkeys called at dawn and again toward dusk, and their sound carried, in the right conditions, for 3 miles through dense forest, which was a distance no other land mammal of comparable size came close to matching. The mechanism was anatomical. The howler had an enormously enlarged hyoid bone at the base of the tongue, hollow and shell-like, forming a resonating chamber that amplified the air pushed through it, and the males had throats built around this apparatus to the point that their heads looked misshapen in profile. The sound itself was not a howl in the sense of a wolf's clean note. It was a deep, rolling, wind-like roar, more like the sound of a heavy surf or a distant aircraft than anything vocal, and it began with a few low grunts, built into a sustained torrent lasting a minute or more, and then died away in a series of descending coughs. Its purpose was territorial, a way for troops to advertise their position and spacing without the expense and danger of actually meeting, and so it was answered from another direction, and then another, and the roar traveled around the horizon of the forest at first light like a rumor. Heard from a hammock in the dark before dawn, it was one of the most primeval sounds on earth. And it was made by a placid vegetarian that spent most of its day asleep in a fork of a tree digesting leaves. The 53rd fact concerned a discovery that explained why the forest at night sounded so full without sounding like chaos. When researchers recorded the nocturnal chorus and analyzed it by frequency, they found that the different singers were not overlapping at random. Each species occupied a distinct band of pitch, or a distinct rhythmic slot, or both, so that the acoustic space was divided up much as physical territory might be. Some crickets sang at 4,000 cycles per second, others at 7, others at 2, and where two species shared a pitch, one of them tended to sing in the pauses of the other, or to call at a different hour of the night, or in a different stratum of the vegetation. The idea was named the acoustic niche hypothesis, and it made evolutionary sense. An insect whose signal was drowned out by a neighbor's would not be found by a mate and would not leave descendants, so selection continually pushed songs apart until the available spectrum was neatly partitioned. The result, to a human ear, was a sound of extraordinary richness that never became mush. Layered like an orchestra tuning, every part audible if attended to. Recordists who worked in such places came to be able to identify a stretch of forest by its chorus alone, the way a person might recognize a room by its echo, and they found that a damaged or thinned forest sounded audibly emptier long before it looked any different. The 54th fact concerned the frogs who supplied most of the personality. The Amazon basin held well over 1,000 species of amphibian, and a single pond on a single night in the wet season might carry the voices of 20 of them at once. Their sounds bore almost no resemblance to the croak that the word frog suggests. There were frogs that ticked like a wristwatch, frogs that produced a single clean bell note repeated at intervals of 10 seconds, frogs that made a noise indistinguishable from a dripping tap, from a hammer on a fence post, from a squeaky hinge, from a rubber band plucked in a tin can, and from a small dog barking twice. There were frogs that sang from the water, frogs that sang from 20 meters up in a bromeliad tank, and frogs that inflated a vocal sac larger than their own heads to do it. Almost all of the calling was done by males. Almost all of it was about attracting females and warning off rivals, and almost all of it was tightly keyed to rainfall, so that a heavy shower at nightfall could turn a silent hollow into a deafening one within 20 minutes. Then, at some point in the small hours, for reasons that were never entirely clear, the whole assembly would fall silent together, as though a switch had been thrown, and for a minute or two there would be nothing at all, and then one of them would begin again, and the rest would follow. The 55th fact concerned two birds that owned the night in different ways. The nightjars worked the open ground, the river beaches and the roads and the clearings, sitting flat on the earth where their mottled plumage made them into a piece of gravel, and flushing up at the last moment in a soft, moth-like flight to take insects out of the air. Their eyes threw back a bright orange coal in a torch beam so that a sandbar at midnight could be found to be scattered with pairs of small fires, none of which had been visible a moment before. The potus worked the purchase. A potu spent the day upright on a broken branch stub with its head tipped back and its eyes almost closed. And in that posture it was not merely camouflaged, but genuinely invisible, indistinguishable from the dead wood it sat on, complete with a texture of bark. At night it opened an enormous mouth and took passing insects, returning each time to the same stub. Its call was the sound that people who had heard it remembered longest, a series of descending, mournful notes, each one lower and softer than the last, unhurried, sad, in a way that seemed deliberate, floating out over the river in the dark. Local tradition across many parts of the basin attached stories of grief and loss to that voice, and having heard it, nobody was inclined to argue. The 56th fact concerned the katydids, which supplied a great deal of the night's texture and were, in daylight, almost impossible to find. A katydid was a long-legged relative of the crickets that had specialized in resembling vegetation, and its commitment to the project was total. There were katydids shaped and colored like fresh green leaves, complete with a false midrib and false lateral veins. There were katydids that mimicked leaves partly eaten by caterpillars, with irregular bites taken out of their wing edges, and the margins of the bites browned exactly as a wound on a real leaf would brown. There were katydids that imitated dead leaves, curled and spotted with false fungal blotches, and one that imitated a leaf covered in lichen so precisely that it appeared to be growing something. At night, these creatures sang by rubbing a scraper on one wing against a file on the other, producing clicks and buzzes and long, dry rattles, many of them at frequencies so high that human ears caught only part of the sound and the rest went on above, in the ultrasonic, for the benefit of other katydids and the considerable inconvenience of the bats that hunted them by listening. The 57th fact concerned the lights. Fireflies were beetles, and they made their glow by combining a compound called luciferin with oxygen under the control of an enzyme, producing light with almost no waste heat, a chemical efficiency that human engineering had never matched. Each species had its own signature, a particular color, and a particular rhythm of flashing. And in a clearing on a warm night, several species might be signaling at once, at different heights and different tempos, low green pulses drifting over the grass, sharper yellow flashes higher among the shrubs. Females answered from the vegetation with a single reply at a precisely timed interval, and the whole exchange was a conversation in a code that admitted no misunderstanding, except that certain predatory females had learned to counterfeit the answering flash of other species in order to eat the males who came to them. More striking still were the click beetles, sometimes called headlight beetles, which carried 2 steady green glowing spots on the thorax and a third on the abdomen. Flying, they showed as a slow-moving pair of lamps crossing the dark. So bright and so steady that people had genuinely used them as lanterns, keeping a few in a perforated gourd to read by or tying them to the ankles to see a path. The 58th fact concerned a light that did not move at all. On the forest floor, on rotting wood and fallen palm fronds and buried logs, certain fungi glowed continuously with a faint cold green light, produced by the same basic chemistry as the fireflies used, though arrived at by a completely separate evolutionary road. In daylight, the wood looked like ordinary wood. On a truly dark night, once the eyes had been given 20 minutes to adjust and no torch had been used, the same patch of ground revealed itself to be scattered with pale, luminous shapes. The outlines of fallen branches drawn in dim green, sometimes a whole log traced along its length, sometimes the delicate gills of a small mushroom shining from beneath its cap. The glow was too weak to read by and too weak to photograph without a long exposure, but it was unmistakable once seen. Why the fungi did it was debated for a long time. And the best supported explanation was advertisement. The light attracted insects which walked over the fruiting bodies and carried spores away on their feet, so that a mushroom which could not move had persuaded something else to do its traveling. Sailors had once called such wood foxfire and carried pieces of it below decks, and it was one of the oldest recorded curiosities in the world. The 59th fact concerned the mammals that dominated the night air. More than 150 species of bat lived in the Amazon basin, which made them, by species count, the largest single group of mammals there, outnumbering all the monkeys, cats, rodents, and deer combined. They divided the work with extraordinary thoroughness. Some hunted insects on the wing by echolocation, screaming into the dark and reading the returning echoes with such precision that they could detect a wire the thickness of a human hair. Some gleaned insects and frogs off leaves, listening for their prey's own calls rather than using sonar, which is why certain frogs went quiet when a shadow passed. Some ate fruit and became, collectively, one of the most important dispersers of seeds in the entire forest, carrying figs and other soft fruit away from the parent tree and scattering the pips beneath their night roosts, so that the pattern of regrowth in a clearing was in part a map of where bats had chosen to hang. Some drank nectar, hovering at night, blooming flowers with tongues as long as their bodies. 3 species drank blood. And a large fishing bat cruised low over still water, dragging enormous clawed feet through the surface and lifting out small fish it had located by the ripples alone, leaving 2 fine, parallel wakes behind it in the starlight. The 60th fact concerned why the night sounded so much larger than the day. After sunset, the ground and the canopy cooled faster than the air above them, and a temperature inversion formed, a layer of cooler air lying beneath warmer air. Sound waves traveling upward through such a layer are bent back down toward the ground instead of escaping into the sky, and so they carry very much further than they would in the afternoon's rising, turbulent, sun-heated air. The practical result was that at 2 a.m, a person could hear a boat motor 20 minutes before it appeared, could hear a tree fall on the far side of a river, could hear the individual notes of a frog several hundred meters off. Against that acoustic backdrop, the most impressive thing about the largest predator in the forest was how rarely it registered at all. The jaguar moved on padded feet with retractable claws through leaf litter that would have betrayed a person at every step, and it hunted by getting close and finishing quickly, and its presence was normally known only by tracks in river mud the following morning, pressed into the sand at a size that made the hand laid beside them look inadequate. When it did call, the sound was not a roar, but a series of deep, coughing, sawing grunts, evenly spaced, unhurried, traveling a long way in that inverted air, and every other animal within earshot adjusted its plans accordingly. The 61st fact concerned an animal that had made slowness into an entire strategy. The 3-toed sloth ate leaves, which are among the least rewarding foods available anywhere, being tough, low in energy, and often mildly poisonous, and it had responded not by eating more of them, but by needing less. Its metabolic rate ran at roughly half what would be expected for a mammal of its size. Its body temperature drifted with the weather rather than being held steady, falling several degrees on a cool night and climbing again when the animal moved into a patch of morning sun, which it did deliberately, positioning itself in the crown of a tree the way a lizard positions itself on a rock. Its stomach was multi-chambered and enormous, occupying a large share of its body cavity, and food could take a month to pass through it. Its muscle mass was unusually low, and its limbs worked mainly as hooks, the long curved claws locking over a branch so that hanging required almost no effort at all, which was why sloths sometimes remained suspended after death. It moved through the canopy at a few meters a minute when it moved at all, and it slept, by the best field measurements, around 9 or 10 hours a day. Rather less than the 15 or 20 of legend. The consequence of all this economy was that a sloth could survive on a diet that would have starved anything more energetic, and could do so in plain sight of predators, because a shape that never moves is a shape that is very rarely seen. The 62nd fact concerned what lived in the sloth's fur, which turned out to be a small ecosystem with an economy of its own. The hairs of a sloth were not smooth, but grooved and cracked along their length, and those grooves collected moisture and held colonies of green algae, so that in the wet season a sloth took on a distinct greenish cast that helped it disappear among the leaves. Living in that algal turf were beetles, mites, and several species of moth that occurred nowhere else on Earth. The moths had synchronized their entire life cycle with one of the sloth's most peculiar habits. Roughly once a week, the animal descended all the way to the forest floor, a slow, laborious, and dangerous journey during which it was clumsy and exposed, in order to defecate at the base of a tree and then climb back up. Why it took that risk instead of simply letting go from a branch was long a puzzle. During the visit to the ground, The female moths left the fur and laid their eggs in the fresh dung where the caterpillars developed, and the emerging adults flew up into the canopy to find another sloth. The moths brought nitrogen into the fur, which fertilized the algae, and the sloth, which could reach around and lick its own coat, appeared to eat some of that algae as a supplement to its poor diet. Whether the arrangement was a true partnership or merely a convenient tangle of habits was still debated, but the weekly climb, made by an animal that did almost nothing else, remained one of the strangest routines in the forest. The 63rd fact concerned the small, bright frogs that hunted by day on the forest floor and did not bother to hide. Poison frogs were colored in combinations that no camouflage would ever produce: scarlet and cobalt, gold and black, orange and green, and the loudness of the coloring was the whole point, an advertisement that the animal was not worth eating. The toxins in their skin, in the most potent species alkaloids of extraordinary strength, were not manufactured by the frogs at all, but sequestered from their diet of mites, ants, and other small arthropods, which was why individuals raised in captivity on ordinary food were entirely harmless, and why populations in different valleys, eating slightly different prey, carried slightly different poisons. The other half of their reputation was tenderness. Poison frogs were among the most attentive parents in the animal world. A male might guard a clutch of eggs laid in damp leaf litter, returning repeatedly to moisten them, and when the tadpoles hatched they wriggled onto his back and were carried, one or several at a time, up into the canopy to be deposited individually in the water held by bromeliad leaves. In several species, the mother then returned to each nursery over the following weeks and laid an unfertilized egg in the water as food for her tadpole, tapping the surface to call it up, so that a creature the size of a thumbnail was running a delivery route through a tree 40 meters tall. The 64th fact concerned the bird at the very top of the forest's arrangements. The harpy eagle was one of the largest and by some measures the most powerful eagle in the world. The female, weighing up to 9 kilograms with a wingspan approaching 2 meters and possessing hind talons the size of a large bear's claws, longer than a grizzly's, capable of exerting a grip that killed by pressure alone. Its wings were relatively short and broad for its weight, an adaptation not to soaring over open country, but to maneuvering at speed between the trunks and branches of a closed canopy, and it hunted by perching motionless for long periods and then dropping onto sloths and monkeys with very little warning. A pair held an enormous territory, often 30 or 40 square kilometers, and nested in the crown of an emergent tree, building a platform of sticks that might be used for decades and could reach 2 meters across. They raised a single chick every 2 or 3 years, and that chick remained dependent for the better part of a year after fledging, which made the species profoundly vulnerable to any disturbance of large trees. Its face was framed by a ruff of gray feathers that it could raise into a disc, focusing sound in the manner of an owl, and a double crest that stood up when the bird was alert, giving it an expression of permanent, rather formal astonishment. The 65th fact concerned a daily gathering on certain riverbanks in the western basin, where a red-brown cliff of exposed clay drew hundreds of parrots at once. Macaws, parakeets, amazons, and parrotlets arrived through the early morning, settling in the trees above, calling and squabbling and waiting, and then dropping in waves onto the bare clay face to scrape and swallow mouthfuls of it. The behavior was called geophagy, and the explanation most strongly supported was chemical. Parrots, ate a great many unripe fruits and seeds that were defended with bitter and toxic compounds, and certain clays bind such compounds in the gut, allowing a bird to eat what would otherwise make it ill. The clays also supplied sodium, which was in genuinely short supply across a basin so far from the sea and so thoroughly leached by rain. The licks were used at the same hours on most days and had been used for generations, and they turned an ordinary muddy bank into one of the loudest and most colorful spectacles on the continent. Scarlet and blue and gold birds packed shoulder to shoulder on a vertical wall of earth. All of them nervous, all of them lifting off in a single crash of wings at the passage of a hawk's shadow, circling and settling back within a minute to carry on. The 66th fact concerned a bird that seemed to have wandered in from another era. The hoatzin lived in the vegetation along quiet waterways, was about the size of a pheasant, wore a spiky rust-colored crest and a startling blue face, and ate leaves, which almost no bird does because leaves are heavy and slow to digest, and flight demands lightness. The hoatzin solved this by fermenting its food in an enlarged crop using bacteria in the manner of a cow, which made it the only known bird with foregut fermentation, gave it a strong manured smell that earned it the name stink bird and rendered it so unappetizing that people rarely hunted it. The fermentation chamber took up so much room in the chest that the flight muscles were reduced, and the hoatzin flew badly, in short, heavy crashing flights from one bush to the next, and spent much of its time resting its breast on a branch. Its most remarkable feature belonged to the young. Hoatzin chicks hatched with 2 functional claws on each wing and used them to clamber about in the branches. If a predator approached the nest, which was always built over water, the chick dropped straight in, swam underwater to safety, and afterwards climbed back up the outside of the vegetation hand over hand, using those claws until it reached the nest again. No other living bird did anything of the kind. The 67th fact concerned a moving event rather than a place. Army ants did not build permanent nests. A colony, which might number 500,000 or more, alternated between a nomadic phase and a stationary phase. And in the nomadic phase, it emptied itself onto the forest floor each morning in a raiding front that advanced across the litter in a fan of many thousands of workers. Everything in the path either fled or was dismembered, and the great majority of what the raid actually caught was other insects, spiders, scorpions, and the occasional unlucky small vertebrate, carried back along a column that ran to the bivouac. That bivouac was itself remarkable. At rest, the colony hung its own body between 2 roots or in a hollow, the workers linking legs to form a living structure with chambers and passages inside it, sheltering the queen and the brood in a house made entirely of ants. Around the raid there traveled a permanent entourage. Certain birds, the antbirds and wood creepers and ant tanagers, did not eat the ants at all, but followed the swarm to catch the insects that fled ahead of it, and had become so specialized in this that they could not feed properly without a raid to attend. Certain flies followed the birds to lay eggs on the fleeing insects. Certain butterflies followed the birds to feed on their droppings. An army ant swarm was therefore a traveling economy, and the sound of a mixed flock of scolding birds low in the understory was a reliable way to find one. The 68th fact concerned a color that was not a color. The blue morpho was a large butterfly whose upper wings shone an electric, almost impossible cobalt, so vivid that individuals flying along a river could be seen from a considerable distance, flashing on and off as the wings beat and the angle changed. That blue was not a pigment. Scraped or ground, the wing scales yielded only brown dust. The color was produced by structure. Each scale was covered in microscopic ridges built in layers a few hundred nanometers apart, and light striking them was reflected repeatedly from those layers, with the reflections canceling out at most wavelengths and reinforcing one another in the blue, so that what reached the eye was an interference effect rather than a dye. This was why the shade changed with the viewing angle, why it was so much more intense than any pigment could be, and why it did not fade with age. Since there was nothing to bleach, the undersides of the same wings were dull brown with large eye spots, so that a morpho at rest on a trunk vanished completely, and a morpho in flight, opening and closing, appeared to blink in and out of existence as it went, which made it maddeningly difficult for a bird to track, and made it for the human observer standing on a forest track. One of the most memorable sights in the tropics. The 69th fact concerned agriculture, practiced in the Amazon for tens of millions of years before anyone thought to try it with a plow. Leafcutter ants did not eat leaves. They cut them in neat semicircular pieces and carried them along cleared trails that could run 100 meters and more. Columns of green fragments moving through the litter like a procession of small sails, and took them underground into nests that could extend several meters deep and contain thousands of chambers. There the leaves were cleaned, chewed to a pulp, and used as a growing medium for a fungus that the colony cultivated and that existed nowhere outside such nests. The ants ate the fungus. They weeded their gardens of competing molds, dosed them with antibiotics produced by bacteria carried on their own bodies, adjusted the ventilation of the nest through a system of shafts to regulate temperature and carbon dioxide, and disposed of waste in dedicated refuse chambers tended by the oldest workers, who were never permitted back into the gardens. A mature colony might contain 8 million individuals and strip a substantial tree of its foliage in a night, and across the basin the leafcutters were among the largest consumers of vegetation of any animal, outweighing in their effect on the forest all the deer and tapirs and monkeys together. The 70th fact concerned an experiment that changed how many species the world believed itself to contain. In the late 1970s, a beetle specialist working in Panama and later in the Amazon began fogging individual tree canopies with a short-lived insecticide and catching what fell into sheets spread beneath. And the results were overwhelming. Single trees yielded well over 1,000 species of beetle apiece, and a large proportion of those beetles appeared to be specialists found on that tree species and no other. Extrapolating from the number of tropical tree species and adding in the other insect orders, he arrived at an estimate of 30 million species of arthropod on Earth, at a time when the accepted figure for all life of every kind was around 1.5 million. The estimate was argued over for decades and later revised downward by most authorities, but the shock of it was permanent because it made clear that the great majority of species on the planet were small, lived in tropical forests, and had never been described. In practical terms, it meant that a person standing beneath a single Amazonian tree on an ordinary afternoon was standing beneath more unnamed kinds of life than were catalogued in most national museums, all of them going about their business, entirely indifferent to whether anyone had got around to writing them down. The 71st fact concerned a tree whose sap changed the shape of the modern world. The rubber tree grew scattered thinly through the forest, never in stands, because a fungus that attacked its leaves made dense plantations impossible in its native range, and its latex was gathered by tappers who walked a circuit of 150 or 200 trees before dawn each day. The cut was a shallow diagonal groove made in the bark with a special curved knife, angled so that the latex ran down into a small cup, and it was made afresh each morning a fraction below the last, so that over years a tree carried a descending herringbone of old scars like a record of the seasons it had been visited. The tapper returned in the afternoon to collect what it gathered, and smoked the liquid over a fire of palm nuts, turning a paddle slowly in the smoke until the latex coagulated in layer upon layer into a heavy dark ball that might weigh 40 kilograms by the time it was rolled down to the river. That work built and ruined enormous fortunes, and it depended on human beings walking alone through the forest before first light for decades on end. The trade collapsed early in the 20th century when seeds smuggled out of the basin established plantations in Southeast Asia where the leaf fungus did not exist and the trees could be grown in rows, and the river towns that had lived on rubber went quiet almost overnight. The forest itself simply carried on producing latex that nobody came to collect. And the herringbone scars healed over slowly, and in many places they can still be found on old trunks by anyone who knows to look. The 72nd fact concerned the pharmacy. A remarkable share of the drugs that transformed medicine came out of tropical American forests, and several came directly from this one. The bark of the cinchona tree, dried and powdered, yielded quinine, the first genuinely effective treatment for malaria and for 3 centuries the only one, a substance so strategically important that empires were built and defended on access to it. The arrow poison called curare, prepared from vines by boiling and reducing the bark over days into a dark paste. Worked by blocking the signal between nerve and muscle, and in the middle of the 20th century, a purified form of that same compound became the basis of modern surgical muscle relaxation, allowing operations that had previously been impossible. A shrub of the region produced pilocarpine, still used in the treatment of glaucoma. Another vine yielded compounds studied for use in cancer therapy, and the venom of a South American pit viper led to the first of the drugs that lowered blood pressure by inhibiting a particular enzyme, a class taken daily by tens of millions. In each case, the underlying observation had been made long before by people who lived in the forest and knew precisely which plant, which part, and which preparation, and the chemistry that followed was an act of translation rather than of discovery. Fewer than 1% of Amazonian plant species had been screened for pharmacological activity by any laboratory. The 73rd fact concerned a nut that could not be farmed, and the chain of dependencies that explained why. The Brazil nut tree was one of the giants of the forest, growing to 50 meters and living for 500 years or more, and its fruit was a woody capsule the size and weight of a cannonball containing a dozen or more seeds packed inside like the segments of an orange. To set fruit, the tree required pollination, and its flowers had a stiff hooded lid that only a large and powerful bee could force open, which in practice meant certain orchid bees. Those bees in turn depended for their own reproduction on particular orchids, from which the males gathered scent compounds used in courtship, and those orchids grew only in undisturbed forest. Once a capsule had ripened and fallen, it lay on the ground sealed, too hard for almost anything to open, except that a large rodent called the agouti possessed teeth equal to the job. The agouti gnawed in, ate some seeds, and buried the rest in scattered caches for later, forgot a proportion of them as all hoarders do, and those forgotten seeds became the next generation of trees. Break any link in that chain, remove the orchids or the bees or the agoutis, and the trees would stand for centuries producing nothing, which is why plantations of Brazil nuts had repeatedly failed, and why every Brazil nut sold anywhere in the world had been gathered by hand from the floor of a standing wild forest. The 74th fact concerned a small dark palm fruit that had gone, within a generation, from a local staple to a global commodity. The acai palm grew in dense clumps of slender stems in the wet floodplain forest near the mouth of the river, and its fruit hung in heavy branched clusters at the top 10 or 15 meters up. Harvesting it had never been mechanized because no machine could be made to do what a person with a loop of woven palm fibre around the ankles could do, which was to climb a stem the thickness of a wrist in a few seconds, cut the cluster, and come down. The fruit itself was mostly stone, with only a thin layer of purple pulp, and it was soaked in warm water and rubbed by hand or by machine to release that pulp into a thick, dark liquid that had almost no sweetness at all. Along the lower river it was eaten as a savory dish, poured over cassava meal and taken with fried fish at any meal of the day, and consumption in some river cities reached extraordinary levels per person. The export version, sweetened and frozen and sold as a health food thousands of miles away, would have been barely recognizable to the households that ate it daily. What mattered ecologically was that the demand made a standing floodplain forest worth more than a cleared one, which in a region where most economic pressure ran the other way was not a small thing. The 75th fact concerned the plant that fed the basin and the ingenious violence required to make it edible. Manioc, also called cassava or yucca, was a shrub whose swollen roots stored starch in quantity, and it grew willingly in soils too poor for almost anything else, which was precisely why it mattered. The difficulty was that the most productive varieties, the so-called bitter manioc, contained compounds that released cyanide when the tissue was damaged, in concentrations high enough to kill. Generations of Amazonian households had worked out a processing sequence that removed the poison entirely. The roots were peeled and grated to a wet mash, and the mash was packed into a tapete, a long tubular basket woven on the diagonal with a loop at each end. Hung from a beam with a pole through the lower loop, the basket was stretched by a person sitting on the pole, and as it lengthened it, narrowed and squeezed, pressing the toxic liquid out through the weave into a pot below. The pressed cake was then sieved and toasted on a wide clay or iron griddle into the coarse, crunchy meal called farinha that accompanied virtually every meal from the Andes to the Atlantic. Even the expressed liquid was not wasted. Boiled long enough to drive off the cyanide, it became a savory sauce. The whole apparatus was made from plants gathered within walking distance, and it solved a chemistry problem that no one had the chemistry to describe. The 76th fact concerned the palms, which deserved a place of their own because a single species could underwrite an entire household. Palms were disproportionately abundant in the Amazon, several of them ranking among the hyperdominant species, and their usefulness was almost comic in its range. The leaves were split and layered to thatch a roof that would shed the heaviest rain for 5 or 6 years. The same leaves, cut young and pale, were plaited into baskets, mats, hats, fans for the cooking fire, and the temporary containers used to carry fish home. The trunk was split for flooring and for walls and for the beams of a raised house. The fibre from the leaf sheath was twisted into cord and fishing line. The fruit of some species was boiled and eaten or pressed for oil, and the oil of one of them was among the richest natural sources of vitamin A known. The growing tip of certain palms was the palm heart of restaurant menus, though taking it killed to stem. The hard seeds of another were carved into buttons and small ornaments and were known as vegetable ivory, and a felled trunk, left to rot for a few weeks, would be found to be full of large, pale beetle grubs, which were gathered by the handful, roasted, and eaten with considerable enthusiasm, tasting, by most accounts, faintly of butter and coconut. The 77th fact concerned a soil that should not have existed. Scattered through the basin, usually along bluffs above the rivers, and usually at spots that would have made good places to live, there were patches of earth entirely unlike the pale, exhausted clay around them. Dark, almost black, deep, crumbly, and astonishingly fertile, holding nutrients and moisture in a way the surrounding ground never did. Farmers had known about these patches for centuries and sought them out, and they had a name, terra preta, the black earth. It was not natural, it was made, deliberately or as a byproduct of long habitation, by people who had lived on those sites for hundreds of years. And it was built out of charcoal from low-temperature fires, together with kitchen refuse, fish bones, turtle shell, pottery sherds, ash, and manure. The charcoal was the essential ingredient because its porous structure resisted decay for millennia and provided an enormous internal surface that held nutrients and sheltered soil microbes. Patches of terra preta could be 2 meters deep and cover many hectares, and they remained fertile more than 500 years after the last person who had contributed to them had gone. Modern agricultural science, arriving at the same idea from the other direction, gave the underlying principle a new name and began adding charcoal to fields, having been beaten to the discovery by roughly 2,000 years. The 78th fact concerned what appeared in the Western Basin when cattle ranching cleared the trees from a stretch of Acre and Rondonia in the later 20th century. Under the vanished forest, visible for the first time from the air, there were geometric earthworks, perfect circles, squares, hexagons and connected compounds outlined by ditches several meters deep and by the banks thrown up beside them, some of them 300 meters across. Many joined to one another by long straight causeways running for kilometers through what was now pasture. More than 450 of these structures were mapped in that region alone, and their construction was dated to a period running from around 2,000 years ago to a few centuries before European contact. Nobody could say with confidence what they were for. Defense seemed unlikely, given the placement and the shallow interiors. Ceremonial use was the most common suggestion, and the precision of the geometry, laid out across uneven ground with an accuracy that implied surveying, supported it. What was beyond dispute was the labor involved, and therefore the population, and therefore the fact that the land which the 20th century had taken to be primeval and empty had once held a great many organized people who moved a very great deal of earth. The 79th fact concerned the instrument that made the rest of those settlements visible without cutting anything down. Airborne laser scanning, sending millions of pulses per second at the ground and timing their return, could detect the small fraction of those pulses that slip between the leaves all the way to the soil and back, and from that fraction a computer could reconstruct the shape of the earth beneath a closed canopy as though the forest had been lifted off. Flown over parts of the Amazon in the 21st century, the technique revealed mounded platforms, plazas, roads, and reservoirs beneath standing forest that had never been cleared. In the Llanos de Mojos of Bolivia, it exposed settlements with stepped conical mounds 20 meters high, surrounded by moats and by radiating causeways. On a scale that obliged archaeologists to redraw their maps of pre-Columbian South America. The forest above these places looked to a visitor on foot like any other forest and had looked so for 500 years. What the laser showed was not ruins in the sense of standing stone, since the buildings had been of earth and wood and had long since returned to the ground, but the shape of the ground itself, which remembered everything. The 80th fact concerned the conclusion that followed. If large populations had lived in the basin for millennia, then the forest they left behind was not untouched wilderness, but something more interesting. Surveys of tree composition found that species useful to people, palms and Brazil nut and cacao and dozens of others, were far more abundant than chance would predict, and that their abundance rose sharply near archaeological sites and along old routes of travel. More than 80 species showed clear signs of domestication or of management, selected over generations for larger fruit, thinner shells, better flavor, and planted, tended, and favored until their descendants dominated whole stretches of forest. The implication was that a substantial part of what looked like wild Amazonia was in fact an orchard gone quiet, planted by people whose societies had been destroyed by introduced disease within a century of first contact, and whose gardens had simply carried on growing without them. Estimates of the pre-contact population of the basin ranged widely, from a few million to something approaching 10. And the collapse was so complete that the forest closed over it, and the survivors' descendants were later described by newcomers as living in an eternal, untouched wild. The trees knew otherwise, and had been quietly saying so all along to anyone who counted them. The 81st fact concerned language and the sheer number of them. Something over 300 distinct languages were still spoken in the Amazon basin, belonging to a handful of large families and to a surprising number of isolates, languages with no demonstrated relatives anywhere on earth. The great families included Tupian, whose speakers had spread across an enormous territory and whose vocabulary supplied a large share of the place names on any map of Brazil, and Arawakan, which had spread even further, reaching the Caribbean islands and Caraban and Panoan and Tucanoan, along certain rivers in the northwest. The social arrangement produced something almost unheard of elsewhere, a rule of linguistic exogamy, under which a person was expected to marry someone who spoke a different language, with the result that most adults were fluent in 3 or 4, and a household might conduct its ordinary business in several at once, each person speaking their father's tongue and understanding everyone else's. Many of these languages had features that upended assumptions linguists had held for a long time, including one with an unusually small inventory of sounds and a grammar so unlike the European pattern that its analysis became internationally controversial. A great many of them were spoken by fewer than 1,000 people. Some were spoken by fewer than 10 and were being recorded sentence by sentence against a deadline that everybody involved understood perfectly well. The 82nd fact concerned the depth of what those speakers knew. When ethnobotanists worked seriously in an Amazonian community, asking not what a plant was called, but what it did, the results were consistently humbling. A single knowledgeable person might name and distinguish several hundred plants growing within a morning's walk, identify them by bark, by smell, by the sound a machete made striking the trunk, and specify for each the season it fruited, the animals that fed on it, the ailments its parts treated, the preparation required, the doses, and the plants with which it must not be combined. Distinctions were drawn between varieties that a trained botanist with a hand lens could not initially separate, and which later genetic work sometimes confirmed as real. Fish were classified with the same precision, and soils and the calls of birds and the stages of the flood. This was not folklore in the sentimental sense, it was a working, technical corpus, accumulated over many centuries of controlled observation by people whose lives depended on getting it right, transmitted orally, and held in the memory of individuals rather than in books. Where the transmission broke because the young left or the language went, the corpus did not degrade slowly. It ended. The 83rd fact concerned the people who had chosen, so far as could be told, to have nothing to do with any of this. Somewhere between 100 and 150 groups living in voluntary isolation were believed to exist worldwide, and the great majority of them were in the Amazon basin, most in the borderlands of Brazil and Peru. They were not undiscovered, and the word uncontacted was a slight misnomer, since most were perfectly aware of the outside world and had made a decision about it. Their presence was established by indirect evidence: garden clearings visible from an aircraft, palm-thatched longhouses, footprints on a beach, abandoned camps, arrows left crossed in a path as a warning, and occasional brief sightings by neighboring communities. Some groups numbered a few dozen, some a few hundred, some were the remnants of larger societies broken up in living memory, and some had been isolated far longer. Their territories were, in several countries, legally recognized and closed to entry, which made them among the very few places on the inhabited surface of the earth that a citizen of any nation was forbidden by law to visit. The 84th fact concerned the largest such territory, the Javari Valley, a stretch of forest on the western border of Brazil, roughly the size of Portugal, set aside in its entirety for indigenous people and containing, by the best estimates, more isolated groups than anywhere else in the world. It was a landscape of low forested hills and black water creeks and vast seasonal swamps. Difficult to reach, with no roads, its rivers narrow and choked with fallen timber, and it was patrolled from a small number of control posts placed at the mouths of the main waterways. The work of those posts was almost entirely negative to stop people going in. Illegal fishing crews, gold miners, loggers, and hunters pressed at the boundaries constantly. And the reason they were kept out was not scenic. It was epidemiological. Groups with no history of exposure to common respiratory viruses had, in every documented case of contact over 2 centuries, suffered catastrophic mortality in the first years, sometimes losing half their number or more to influenza, measles, and whooping cough within a season. A single visitor with a cold could end a people. The 85th fact concerned why the isolation existed at all, and the answer lay in a period of about 40 years around the turn of the 20th century. The rubber boom required labor, and the labor was obtained in the upper reaches of the tributaries by force. Whole communities were seized, indebted, worked, and destroyed, and in certain districts the violence was so extreme that it became an international scandal when a British consular investigation documented it in detail. The peoples who survived that period did so mostly by walking away from the rivers, abandoning the fertile floodplains where their ancestors had lived and retreating into the interfluvial uplands. The poor country between the tributaries, where there were no navigable waterways and therefore no boats and therefore no raiders. That retreat was not a primitive condition, but a deliberate and costly strategy, and it worked. Isolation, in other words, was a historical decision taken by people who had seen the alternative, and the arrows crossed in the path were not the sign of a society that had never met the modern world, but a message from one that had. The 86th fact concerned the policy that grew out of that history. For much of the 20th century, official practice in several countries had been to seek out isolated groups and establish contact, on the theory that contact was inevitable and that a managed version would be gentler. The results were consistently disastrous, with mortality rates after first contact running so high that the policy became indefensible, and in the late 1980s it was formally reversed. The new principle was no contact except at the initiative of the isolated group itself. Enforcement meant monitoring rather than meeting, overflights at a respectful altitude to count houses and gardens, riverside posts to intercept intruders. Expeditions on the ground that deliberately turned back once fresh signs were found, and the mapping of territories so that logging and mining concessions could be refused. It was a strange discipline, an entire branch of a government agency dedicated to knowing where people were in order to leave them alone, and its practitioners spoke of it with the seriousness of people who understood that success would produce no visible achievement at all. The 87th fact concerned the way almost everyone else in the basin traveled, which was by riverboat, and which had a particular character that anyone who had done it never forgot. The vessels were broad wooden double-deckers painted white and blue, with an open lower deck for cargo and an upper deck given over entirely to hammocks. Passengers boarded hours early to claim a good spot, slung their hammocks from the overhead rails in overlapping tiers so dense that the deck became a single quilted mass of colored cloth, and lived there for 2, 3, or 5 days as the boat worked upriver. Meals were served from a hatch at the stern. Children ran between the hammocks. Someone always had a radio. The engine noise was constant and low and became inaudible within an hour. At night the boat ran with a searchlight, sweeping the bank for floating logs, and the hammocks swung gently in unison with the vessel's motion, and the forest slid past at 11 kilometers an hour, and there was very little to do except watch it. Travelers reported that they slept better on those decks than they had slept in years, which was a fact of some relevance to the purpose of this account. The 88th fact concerned what happened at the other end. In the river cities, the market began in the dark. Boats came in from the tributaries through the small hours and tied up 3 and 4 abreast at the fish dock. And by 4 in the morning, the stalls were laid out under bare bulbs with the night's catch on wet concrete, tambaki, piraruchu in slabs, catfish of a dozen kinds, some of them longer than the tables they lay on. Around the fish came the rest, sold from boats and from barrows and from the ground, and the variety of the fruit was the part that startled visitors most. Because the great majority of it had no name in any European language and had never been exported anywhere, kupwaku, bakuri, kamu, boriti, pupunya, boiled, and served warm with salt, tukuma, graviola, and a dozen more that came and went with their brief seasons. By 7, the heat had arrived and the fish were gone. By 9, the market was being hosed down. and the boats that had unloaded were already going back upriver with sacks of salt and diesel and roofing sheets and school exercise books, which was the other half of the same transaction and much less photographed. The 89th fact concerned what the rubber money built. For roughly 3 decades, until the plantations of Asia ended it, the wild latex of the Amazon supplied a world that had suddenly discovered the bicycle tire, the motor car, the insulated cable, and the waterproof coat, and the price rose accordingly. Manaus, 1,000 miles up the river, became for a short while one of the wealthiest cities in the Americas. It installed electric street lighting before many European capitals, and an electric tram system and a water supply, and it built an opera house of a magnificence entirely out of proportion to its population, with a dome tiled in imported ceramic, ironwork from Scotland, marble from Italy, and a stage curtain painted in Paris. The story that the wealthy sent their laundry to Portugal was probably an exaggeration repeated too often, but it survived because it caught the tone of the thing. When the price collapsed, the city emptied of capital almost at once, and the grand building stood in a small, hot provincial port for 60 years with a forest pressing at the edges. The opera house was restored eventually and put back to use, and the odd sensation of hearing an orchestra tune in a gilded auditorium 1,000 miles from the sea remained available to anyone who arrived on the right night. The 90th fact concerned the naturalists, and one of them in particular. In the middle of the 19th century, a self-taught Englishman from a family of hosiers traveled to the Amazon with a friend and stayed for 11 years, living on the proceeds of specimens shipped home to collectors, working alone for most of that time, frequently ill, frequently broke, and collecting with a thoroughness that has never really been matched. He brought back somewhere near 14,500 species, of which more than 8,000 were new to science, the great majority of them insects. More important than the count was what he noticed while making it. He found harmless butterflies whose wing patterns had come to resemble, with great precision, those of unrelated species that birds had learned to avoid. And he worked out what the resemblance was for, and in doing so gave the first clear natural explanation of mimicry, published just after the theory of natural selection appeared and taken up immediately as evidence for it. His account of the years he spent doing it was written plainly, without heroics, and it remained in print for a very long time. Partly because of the science, and partly because of the way he described the ordinary hours, the heat, the rain on the roof, and the immense green monotony that he never once claimed to have grown tired of. The 91st fact concerned what the forest was holding. Carbon accumulates in wood, and a mature tropical forest of that size held a great deal of it. Estimates for the Amazon ran to something between 150 and 200 billion tons locked into the trunks, branches, roots, and soil, which was on the order of a decade of the entire world's emissions from every source, standing quietly in one place, doing nothing but growing. The living trees added a little every year, taking carbon dioxide out of the air and building it into cellulose, and the dying trees released a little as they rotted, and for most of the 20th century the balance ran modestly in favor of storage, so that the basin acted as a sink, absorbing more than it gave back. That balance was fine, and it depended on things staying much as they had been. Measurements from long-term forest plots, some of them monitored tree by tree for 40 years by researchers who returned with tape and paint to the same numbered trunks, showed the margin narrowing. It was one of the few places where a global process could be observed at the scale of an individual tree in an individual clearing by a person with a notebook, doing arithmetic that anyone could follow. The 92nd fact concerned proportion. The Amazon accounted for roughly half of the tropical rainforest remaining on Earth, and although it covered only about 1% of the planet's surface, it was thought to hold in the region of 10% of all species known to science, with an unknown but certainly larger share of those not yet known. The numbers that could be stated with confidence were still remarkable. More than 16,000 species of tree, over 2,300 fish, more than 1,400 birds, well over 400 mammals, several hundred reptiles, more than 1,000 amphibians, and a quantity of insects and other invertebrates that nobody pretended to be able to bound. New vertebrate species were being described from the basin at a rate of roughly one every few days across one recent decade, including monkeys, river dolphins, and a good number of birds, which was extraordinary given that vertebrates are the group naturalists have picked over most thoroughly. To put it another way, in a world that had been cataloged and photographed and mapped down to the meter, there remained one large green region where the basic question of what lives here had a genuinely open answer. The 93rd fact concerned where the forest had stayed standing, and the pattern was clear enough to be seen from orbit. Satellite imagery of the basin over several decades showed clearance spreading along roads in a distinctive herringbone. The main track cut first and side tracks branching off it at regular intervals, and the pattern filling in over years into solid pasture. What the same imagery showed with equal clarity was where the pattern stopped. It stopped at the boundaries of indigenous territories, often with a straight edge visible for 100 kilometers, forest on one side and cleared grass on the other. And the difference in deforestation rates between the two sides was not marginal, but many-fold. Analyses across the whole basin found consistently that recognized indigenous lands retained their forest better than almost any other category of land, including some formerly protected reserves, and that where land rights were secure the effect was strongest. This was not a matter of the land being remote, because the comparisons controlled for that. It was a matter of who held it and whether that holding was enforced, which made the map of the forest, in a very real sense, a map of a legal argument. The 94th fact concerned a plant that turned pollination into a 2-night procedure involving heat, scent, and a locked room. The giant water lily of the Amazon floated leaves on the still backwaters that could exceed 2.5 meters across, circular, with a turned-up rim and an underside armed with spines, and stiffened by a radiating framework of ribs so strong that a leaf could support a considerable weight, a fact demonstrated in Victorian glasshouses by standing a child on one. The flower opened after dusk, white, enormous, and gave off a strong pineapple-like scent while raising its own temperature several degrees above the surrounding air, which carried the perfume further. Scarab beetles flew to it and crawled into the warm chamber at its center to feed. Toward dawn the flower closed, trapping them inside for the whole of the following day, during which time they were fed and dusted with pollen. On the second evening it opened again, now turned pink or deep red and no longer scented, and released the beetles, who flew off carrying pollen and went straight to the nearest fresh white flower, which was precisely the point. The 95th fact concerned the birds and the peculiar experience of trying to count them. More than 1,400 species had been recorded in the basin, and a competent observer working a single good site with a mixture of habitats could see or hear over 300 species in a day. a figure that would represent a very good year in most temperate countries. The reason was not merely diversity, but stratification. The forest offered a dozen different lives at different heights, and the birds had divided them minutely. There were species that fed only in the leaf litter, species that fed only on the trunks, species that hunted only along the vine tangles, species that specialized in dead, curled leaves hanging in the understory and probed each one for the insects sheltering inside, species that occurred only within 20 meters of a river's edge, and species that never in their lives descended below the canopy and were therefore known to most ornithologists only as voices. Mixed flocks moved through the forest as traveling companies of 20 or 30 species at once, each with its own foraging niche, sweeping an area and moving on, so that a patch of woodland could be silent and apparently birdless for an hour, and then contain 100 birds for 4 minutes, and then be silent again. The 96th fact concerned the largest land animal in the forest and the quiet importance of its digestion. The lowland tapir weighed up to 1/4 of a ton, had a short prehensile snout that it used to draw leaves into its mouth, swam readily, walked on trails it had used for generations, and was so retiring that people could live nearby for years without seeing one. It ate fruit in enormous quantity, and crucially it ate large fruit with large seeds, the kind that no bird could swallow and no monkey would carry far, and it moved several kilometers a night, and it deposited those seeds, intact and viable and packaged in fertilizer, far from the parent tree. A number of Amazonian trees with big, heavy seeds had no other effective disperser at all. Having evolved alongside a much larger caste of big animals, most of which had gone extinct at the end of the last ice age, leaving the tapir to do the work of several. Where tapirs were hunted out, the composition of the forest began to shift within decades, quietly, in a direction nobody had chosen, because the trees that depended on them simply stopped arriving anywhere new. The 97th fact concerned the plainest thing the river did, which was to feed people. Across the basin, fish supplied the great majority of the animal protein eaten by the rural population, at rates of consumption among the highest recorded anywhere in the world, in some communities exceeding 150 kilograms per person per year. This was not commercial fishing in the industrial sense. It was a household activity conducted with hand lines, cast nets, gill nets, harpoons, traps woven from split palm, and long, thin bows carried out from canoes in the early morning and the late afternoon by people who knew where the fish would be in each stage of the flood. The knowledge involved was specific and hard-won: which lake filled first, which channel the migrating shoals took, which fruiting tree would draw tambaki in March, which stretch of bank held the big catfish in the low water of September. In several regions, the communities themselves organized the management, agreeing which lakes would be closed and which fished, and enforcing it among themselves. And where that happened, the stocks recovered measurably. The largest fishery in the basin had no boats over 10 meters and no companies in it at all. The 98th fact concerned scale as experienced rather than as stated. A person could board an aircraft at one edge of the basin and fly for 4 hours over unbroken forest. And for that entire time, the view from the window would not meaningfully change. There would be green textured like the surface of a cauliflower, going to the horizon in every direction and running through it the loops and oxbows, and cut off meanders of rivers, brown or black or the pale green of shallow water over sand. curling back on themselves in patterns that a river only makes when it has had a very long time and very flat ground on which to make them. Occasionally there would be a thread of smoke, or a scar of clearing, or the straight unnatural line of a road, and these registered exactly as a scratch registers on a table. Then the forest would resume. Pilots who flew the basin routinely described a particular disorientation that came with it, the difficulty of judging distance or altitude over a surface with no scale in it, and travelers reported something similar and less technical, which was the gradual failure of the mind to keep believing in the size of what it was looking at. The 99th fact concerned the quietest hour, which came later than most people expected. The insect chorus that filled the early night did not run through until morning. Somewhere in the small hours, usually between 3 and 4:30, the katydids and crickets thinned out, the frogs finished their business and stopped, the nightjars settled, and the forest arrived at a genuine lull. The one stretch in the whole 24 hours when very little was calling at all. What remained was water, the drip from leaves that had been rained on hours earlier, the small suck and slap of the river against a bank, the occasional heavy plop of a fruit falling into a backwater. Air moved a little in the cooling hours before dawn and made a dry rustle high up. Somewhere, a boat's engine, very far off, going somewhere. It was the hour in which the whole enormous system came closest to rest, and the temperature reached its low, and mist began to gather over the water, and anyone still awake at that point in the forest would have found, on trying to describe it later, that the word they reached for first was not wild or vast or green, but simply peaceful. The 100th fact concerned what ended that lull, and it was worth waiting for. Roughly 40 minutes before the sun cleared the horizon, in light too faint to read by, the first bird would begin, usually a tinamou on the ground with a long, clear whistle that faded at the end. Then another answered, further off. Within 10 minutes a dozen species had joined, then 50. Then more than could be separated, and the howler monkeys would start their rolling roar somewhere upriver and be answered from 2 directions, and the parrots would come over in pairs heading out to feed, shouting, and the whole forest that had been almost silent 20 minutes earlier would be at full volume in every register at once. It lasted about half an hour. Then it thinned, and the ordinary business of the day took over, and by 8 o'clock the loudest sound was the cicadas, and the heat was already building. That was the 100th fact, and it completes the count. 100 quiet facts about a river, a forest, and the things living in and above and beneath them, gathered from the water and a canopy and a night and a long human history underneath the leaves. And now that the counting is finished and there is nothing further to keep track of, nothing left to number, and no total still to reach, what remains is only description, offered slowly, for no purpose at all except to fill the last part of the night with something soft to listen to. So the 100 facts can be set down, and the mind can stop gathering, and what follows is simply a journey up that river from the sea to the mountains, taken at the speed the river itself would have preferred, with the lamp out and the window open. It began at the mouth, which was less a mouth than an argument between a river and an ocean conducted across 150 miles of shallow brown water. There was no single opening. There were channels and islands, and between them the great flat island of Marajo lying like a lid over the middle of it, and beyond that the delta of the Para, and a maze of tidal creeks called furrows that ran between one channel and another and were navigable only by people who had grown up in them. The tide reached far inland here, not with salt, but with pressure, so that even hundreds of kilometers upstream the river rose and fell twice a day in a small polite echo of the ocean's schedule, and the boats tied at the landings lifted and settled accordingly. The vegetation along those tidal creeks was dominated by a slender palm that grew in enormous stands, its trunk smooth and its crown a shuttlecock of long divided leaves. And in the low sun, the whole shoreline became a wall of those crowns standing at every angle, hundreds of thousands of them, going back from the water as far as the eye could follow. Small houses stood at intervals on stilts with a plank walkway running out to a landing stage, and each landing had a canoe or two tied to it. And children stood on them and waved at the passing boat with the automatic thoroughness of people who had waved at every boat that had ever passed. The water was the color of milky tea. The sky in the late afternoon was piled with cumulus, turning gold on their western faces and blue-gray underneath, and the whole enormous cloudscape was reflected in the flat river so completely that the horizon became a matter of opinion. Going upstream in the evening, the boat kept close to the bank to stay out of the main current, and at that distance the forest resolved into individual trees rather than a mass. There were figs with their pale hanging root curtains, there were cecropias, the fast pioneer trees, silver-backed and open-branched, standing out from the darker crowns wherever a gap had opened, their leaves shaped like hands with the fingers spread. There were the great smooth trunks of the emergence further back, and between them the tangle of secondary growth that always accumulated along the light-flooded edge, so that the shoreline appeared to be a solid green wall, while the forest 50 meters behind it was open and dim and easy to walk through. Kingfishers went ahead of the boat in short, low flights, settling and being overtaken and going again. A pair of macaws crossed high up, going straight, calling once. On a mud bank a caiman lay with its jaws slightly open and did not move as the wash reached it. Dusk came quickly, as it always did, and the western sky went orange and then a deep, clean green above the tree line before fading. And the first stars appeared while there was still color in the water. Bats came out over the river in the last of the light, working low, and the swifts that had been feeding all day higher up went to their roosts in hollow trunks and behind waterfalls, dropping in from above in tight spiraling flocks. Somewhere on shore the first frog began, and then 100 more. And the sound of the night assembled itself while the engine went on turning. The boat ran on into the dark with a searchlight sweeping the water ahead for logs, and in that beam the river showed itself full of things drifting seaward. Whole trees with their root plates still attached, mats of floating grass, a coconut, a plank, a dead branch turning slowly with a bird standing on it. In the villages the generators ran until 9 or 10, and the lights along the banks appeared and slid past and vanished, and after they went out the only illumination for hours at a time was whatever was in the sky. On a clear night near the equator that was a considerable amount. The stars of both hemispheres were available at once. The Southern Cross low over the trees on one side and the familiar northern figures on the other, and between them the Milky Way stood up almost vertically, so dense and so bright over that dark forest that its structure was visible to the naked eye, the great rift running through it like a river of its own. Along the shore, in the still water beneath overhanging branches, the reflections of individual stars lay unbroken for minutes at a time. Further upriver the water changed, and the change could be smelt before it could be seen. Where a black tributary came in, The air took on a cool, faintly resinous tea-like quality, and the mosquitoes fell away almost entirely, and the wash from the boat turned from milky brown to something like strong coffee. And then, on a bright day, to a clear amber against the pale sand of the shallows. The beaches along a black river were white and clean, and in the dry season they stood high and wide and were used by turtles and by terns and by people, who camped on them and hung hammocks between the driftwood and slept in the open where there were no insects to speak of. The forest along such a river was lower and denser and more thorny than the Varzea downstream, and it was full of small, hard-leaved trees defending their meager chemistry, and the water that ran off it was so clear that a canoe crossing a shallow bay appeared to be suspended over a floor of pale sand, throwing a sharp shadow. Fish could be seen down there, unhurried, in twos and threes. Turning off the main stream into an igapo at high water was like entering a flooded cathedral. The current disappeared. The paddle made the only sound, a small, clean knock and a drip, and the reflections were so complete that the trunks seemed to continue downward as far as they rose, doubled in the black glass, and the canoe seemed to float in the middle of a space rather than on the surface of one. Light came down in shafts where the canopy had opened, and each shaft lit a column of water for 2 or 3 meters and then gave up. Fallen leaves hung suspended just under the film, drifting nowhere. Bromeliads sat in the branch forks at what was now shoulder height, and a hand run over one found the cool water in the cup and, sometimes, something small that objected. It was possible to sit in such a place with the paddle across the knees and not move for half an hour, and in that half hour the forest would forget the intrusion and resume. A wood creeper working up a trunk in short jerks, a troop of squirrel monkeys crossing overhead in a loose, noisy stream that took 4 minutes to pass, the flick of a fish taking something off the surface, the low, mechanical grind of a distant dynamo. At night, the same place became something else again. The reflections went. The water turned to a flat, absolute, unreflecting black that swallowed a torch beam without any suggestion of depth, and the only thing that came back was eye-shine, the small, ruby coals of caimans set low and close together, sometimes a dozen of them scattered across a bay, holding perfectly still, and the paler green pinpoints of spiders on the trunks, which appeared at a certain angle in astonishing numbers, hundreds of them in a single beam, all of them minute, all of them looking back. Turning the torch off restored the dark completely, and the sounds came forward, and the forest above became a ceiling of noise that could be listened into in layers, the high, steady ring of one insect, the slower pulsing of another beneath it, a frog with a note like a struck bottle, a frog that ticked, another that made a sound very like a small stone dropped on a bigger one, and underneath everything the soft, irregular percussion of the drip, which never entirely stopped. Higher up the basin, where the tributaries came down off the last of the hills, the character changed once more. The rivers narrowed and began to have a current worth mentioning. Their water ran clear and cool over beds of pale stone, and there were riffles and the sound of moving water, which was almost entirely absent from the flat country downstream, became a constant feature of the nights. The forest here was on slopes, which meant that a person walking through it moved between levels and could look across at the canopy from the side rather than only from beneath, and the canopy seen from the side revealed itself as a landscape in its own right, with its own hollows and ridges and clearings, its own weather, its own permanent inhabitants who never came down. Streams cut small ravines with tree ferns standing in them, and the air in those ravines was several degrees cooler and permanently saturated, and moss grew there in a way it never did in the lowlands. Further west, on the last long slopes before the mountains, the cloud sat in the trees for most of every day, and everything in the forest was hung with epiphytes and bearded with moss to the tips of the smallest twigs, and water condensed out of the air onto the leaves and ran off them and fell continuously, so that these forests produced their own rain from mist alone and were wet under a sky that was not raining. And then the trees stopped. Not abruptly, but over a few 100 meters of altitude, they shortened and thinned and became scrub, and the scrub became tussock grass, and the grass became a high cold plateau of wet ground and gray rock, with the wind moving over it and nothing standing more than knee-high. This was the country where the water came from. Cloud lay along the ground in the mornings, ice formed in the shadows. A stream ran out of the gravel at the foot of a snowfield, no wider than a boot, cold enough to numb a hand in a few seconds, and it gathered other threads and became a rivulet and went over the lip of the plateau in a long tumbling descent, and everything it did from that point onward was downhill and eastward, and would remain so for 4,000 miles. It would fall through the cloud forest and be joined by the mist water. It would pass through the foothills and turn brown with ground rock. It would flatten out and slow and spread and become one of the great tributaries, and then part of the main river, and then part of that vast brown flood that rose into the trees each year and fell again. And eventually it would pass beneath a boat carrying hammocks and go out through the tidal creeks past the palms and the waving children and float for 100 miles as fresh water on the surface of the sea before it finally consented to become salt. And every part of that journey was happening at once, at every moment, in 10,000 places, all night, whether or not anyone was awake to consider it. There was one other vantage worth describing, and it required climbing. At a handful of research stations across the basin, towers had been built up through the forest to the level of the canopy and a little above it, lattices of scaffolding bolted together and guyed to the ground, with a small platform at the top and a great many ladders in between. The climb took 20 minutes and passed through every layer in turn, which was the real value of it. At the bottom the air was still and warm and smelled of leaf mold, and the light was the deep green twilight of the understory, and the ladder rungs were slippery with a damp that never left them. 10 meters up, the palms and saplings fell away, and there was nothing but bare trunk and open space, and the air moved slightly for the first time. At 25 meters, the first branches of the canopy trees came level with the tower, and suddenly there were leaves within arm's reach again, and epiphytes on every horizontal surface, whole gardens of bromeliads and orchids and trailing ferns growing out of pockets of accumulated debris in the branch forks, with ants running over them and a frog sitting in a cup of water and small hard fruits that had never fallen because nothing had ever knocked them loose. At 35 meters, the ladder came out through the roof of the world. What was up there was not a forest at all in any sense that made sense from below. It was a rolling, sunlit, wind-blown plain of foliage, extending in every direction to a horizon that was slightly hazy with the moisture the trees were exhaling, textured like the surface of a very large green cauliflower, and interrupted here and there by the crowns of the emergence standing above the general level like isolated hills. Every crown was a different shade. Some were the dark blue-green of old leaves, some were flushing bright copper or wine red with new growth, which many tropical trees produce in a soft, limp, red flush before it hardens and turns green. And some were entirely covered in flowers, a whole tree gone yellow or violet or white all at once, with no leaves showing at all. And each of those flowering crowns was busy in a way that was audible from the platform, a haze of bees and wasps and hummingbirds working it from first light. The temperature up there was 10 degrees hotter than the ground at midday and several degrees cooler at night. The humidity was far lower, and the wind, which never reached the forest floor at all, blew steadily enough to make the whole platform sway with the tree it was tied to. At dusk, the platform was the best seat available anywhere. The sun went down into the haze on the western horizon and turned the entire green plain gold, and then orange, and then a flat dull bronze, and the towers of cumulus that had rained in the afternoon stood over the far edge of it, catching the last light on their upper thousands of feet, while their bases went purple and lightning began to work inside them silently. Too far away for any sound to arrive, swifts poured past at eye level in loose companies heading for their roosts. Bats came up out of the foliage in ones and twos, and then in numbers. Parrots crossed in pairs. Somewhere below, in the dark that had already arrived under the leaves, the frogs would have been starting. But from up there almost none of that sound reached the platform, because the canopy that muffled everything from above muffled it just as thoroughly from beneath, and the effect was of sitting on the roof of an enormous building and hearing only a faint suggestion of the party going on inside it. The stars came out over an unbroken black plain with not one artificial light in any direction, and the platform creaked. And the wind moved through the leaves with a sound like slow surf, and it was possible to sit up there for hours with a blanket and see nothing move at all except the sky. Coming down again in the dark, hand over hand, with the torch in the teeth and the layers passing in reverse, the sound came back layer by layer, faint at 30 meters, definite at 20. And by the time the boots touched the litter, it was the full nocturnal roar again, close and dense and utterly enveloping, as though the forest had been holding it all in reserve, waiting for the climber to come back down to the level where such things were properly heard. Somewhere in the middle of all that, on any given night, there was a camp. It was never very much, a clearing the size of a small room, made by cutting a few saplings and clearing the litter back, with 4 trees standing conveniently apart at its corners. Hammocks were slung between them at a comfortable height, each with a mosquito net gathered over it and a tarpaulin above that, pitched steeply and guyed out so that the rain would run off the sides rather than pool in the middle. A fire was made small and kept small, of dead wood gathered from the ground, and it was used for the pot and then allowed to sink to embers, because a big fire in that place would only have drawn insects and made everyone hotter than they already were. Supper was rice and farina and whatever had come out of the water in the afternoon, eaten from enamel plates, and afterwards the plates were rinsed at the edge of the creek by torchlight, while the plate washer kept half an eye on the water. Then the light was put out, and the camp went quiet, and its inhabitants lay in their hammocks in the dark, with their arms behind their heads, and listened, because for the first hour there was nothing else to do and nothing else worth doing. The hammock was the crucial piece of equipment, and its virtues took a night or two to appreciate. It kept the sleeper off the ground, which meant away from the ants and the damp and the things that moved through the litter. It hung so it swayed slightly with breathing, and with any shift of weight. And that motion, so small as to be almost undetectable, turned out to be curiously effective at persuading a nervous body to let go. It also imposed a particular posture, a slight curve, which people who had grown up in one considered the correct way to sleep, and which took a few nights for a newcomer's back to accept. Above it, the tarpaulin cut off the sky, so that the sense of the enormous dark forest overhead was replaced by the sense of a small taut roof a meter away, and rain on that roof, when it came, was the most companionable sound available. The net enclosed everything in a soft gray box. It was, in every practical sense, a room, and it weighed a kilogram, and it could be taken down in 4 minutes and carried anywhere. Through the first part of the night, the sounds arrived in a predictable order and then stopped being separate. At around 9, the cabbage nearest the camp, always the loudest thing in the world, would begin its dry ratchet from a leaf perhaps 2 meters from a sleeper's ear, and would carry on for a while and then move. Frogs worked the wet hollow behind the camp in shifts. Something in the litter, probably a large cockroach or a small rodent, would make a series of rustles that any anxious person could interpret however they wished. Occasionally there was a crash somewhere out in the dark, a branch coming down, or an animal moving carelessly, and the whole chorus would drop out for 2 or 3 seconds and then resume exactly where it had left off, which was the most reassuring thing that ever happened in a night forest, because it meant that whatever it was had been assessed by 10,000 small experts and found to be of no consequence. By 11, the sleeper had stopped tracking any of it. The noise had become a single texture with a shape rising and falling like the sound of a motorway heard from a hillside, and the brain had filed it away and gone off duty. Rain in the night began without preamble. There was no gathering wind, no distant rumble to give warning, because the storm had already been overhead for some minutes as cloud before it began to release anything. The first indication was a change in the noise up in the canopy, a soft, general hissing that swelled over about 30 seconds into a roar, and then the drops began arriving on the tarpaulin, first singly and heavily, having fallen 40 meters and gathered on the way, and then in a rush. The temperature dropped. The insects stopped, all of them at once. For as long as the rain lasted, which might be 20 minutes and might be 2 hours, the only sound in the world was water on canvas, absolutely steady, absolutely uniform, without pattern or event, and it was the closest thing that forest offered to silence, because a sound with no information in it is functionally a kind of quiet. People slept through it who had lain awake in the noisy, dry hours before. And then it stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and the dripping took over, slower and more irregular. Thousands of individual drops falling from leaf to leaf, all the way down through the layers, and arriving on the tarpaulin at random intervals for the next half hour, tap, and then 2 together, and then nothing, and then another, gradually thinning out. By then the frogs had started again, greatly encouraged, and the world was fuller and cooler than it had been before. Out on the water, on a night without rain, there were other things to look at. Fireflies worked the vegetation along a creek in slow drifting arcs, and their reflections went with them upside down in the black water, so that each insect appeared to be accompanied by a partner beneath the surface performing the same movements in mirror. Where a floating meadow had gathered, the light of a torch swept across it and found the eyes of frogs sitting up among the grass stems and the fine parallel lines of a fishing bat's wake, and, once in a while, the pale streamlined shape of something larger moving away beneath. Fish jumped. In the shallows, the water was warm enough that a hand left in it forgot it was in anything. The mist began to form around 1 in the morning, appearing first as a thin haze that took the definition out of the far bank, thickening over the next hours into a low white layer that lay on the water and rose no higher than the height of a canoe, so that anyone crossing at 4 would have been moving through it with their upper body in clear, cold air and everything below the elbow invisible. Toward 3, the great lull arrived, exactly as described, and the difference was immediately noticeable to anyone who happened to surface briefly from sleep. The wall of insect noise that had been holding steady for 6 hours simply thinned and then was not there anymore. What was left was so quiet that the individual sounds became events again. A drip, a long pause, another drip. The creak of the hammock rope against the bark as a sleeper turned, the small rush of a fish somewhere out on the water and once very far off. The two-note hoot of an owl repeated 3 times and not repeated again. The air was at its coolest, and for the only stretch of the 24 hours a blanket was actually welcome. If the sky was clear, the stars over the clearing had wheeled a long way west since the last time anyone had looked at them. If it was not, the darkness was total. The kind of darkness in which an open hand held in front of the face registered as nothing whatever, and in which the sense of having a body at all became slightly negotiable. It was in that hour that the size of the place made itself felt, not as a fact, but as a sensation, because the quiet extended in every direction for a very long way, over hills and creeks and flooded woods and sandbanks, past sleeping villages and empty beaches and the tracks of animals going about their own arrangements without meeting anything that would have interrupted it for hundreds and hundreds of miles. It was not a lonely feeling. It was, by most accounts, the opposite, the particular ease that comes from being a very small and entirely unimportant part of something that is functioning perfectly well and will continue to do so. The end of that quiet was gradual rather than sudden, and it announced itself in light long before it announced itself in sound. At around 4:30, the sky above the clearing stopped being black and became a very dark blue, and the shapes of the nearest trunks separated themselves from the general darkness and stood out as slightly less dark verticals, and the tarpaulin overhead became visible as a plane rather than an absence. The mist on the water thickened at exactly that moment, as it always did. Because the coldest part of the night arrives with the first light rather than before it, and the whole surface of a creek would be covered in a level white blanket, a meter deep, drifting very slowly downstream, with the black tops of half-drowned branches standing up through it. The air smelled of wet leaves and cold water, and, faintly, of the smoke from the previous night's fire. Nothing was calling. And then, without any preliminary, the first tinamo. It was a long, clear, ascending whistle, delivered from somewhere on the ground, perhaps 200 meters off, sustained for 2 full seconds and fading at the end as if the bird had walked away from its own note. There was a pause of perhaps 15 seconds. Then it came again, and this time another answered from a different quarter, and after that the interval between new voices shortened rapidly. A woodcreeper started a descending rattle. A trogon began its slow, monotonous series of hoots, each one identical to the last. 2 motmots duetted somewhere near the water. A screaming piha delivered its extraordinary 3-note whistle, a sound so loud and so piercing that it carried further than anything else in the forest except the howlers, and so characteristic of the region that it had been used behind virtually every jungle scene ever filmed anywhere. Wrens joined in with elaborate whistled phrases in which male and female alternated their notes so precisely that the result sounded like one bird. Toucans began their croaking yelp from the crowns, sitting in the first sun while the ground was still in shadow. And beneath all of it, arriving as though a distant engine had been started, the howler monkeys began to roar. The sound rolling out over the canopy from somewhere upriver and being answered from two other directions, holding for a minute at a time, dying away, resuming. By 5:15 the volume was as high as it ever became. It was not a pleasant, orderly dawn chorus of the kind a northern hedgerow produces, all of it in the same register and all of it sweet. It was enormous and disorganized, and came from every distance and every height at once, with hoots and rattles and whistles and shrieks and mechanical buzzes overlapping without regard for one another, and it had the quality of an entire orchestra tuning up in a hall with no ceiling. It lasted about half an hour at that intensity, and then began, imperceptibly, to disperse. The sun cleared the trees at around 6, and the change was immediate. Shafts came through the canopy at a low angle and lit the mist from the side, so that for perhaps 20 minutes the forest was full of solid-looking bars of gold slanting down through the vapor, each one crowded with drifting particles and with insects that flew into the light and became briefly incandescent and then went out again as they passed through. On the water, the mist lifted from the surface in slow curling columns and dissolved a meter or two above it. Steam rose from the wet trunks. The temperature climbed noticeably within a quarter of an hour, and the last of the night's cool went out of the air, and everything that had been sharp and quiet became warm and busy. The morning's work started early everywhere because of that heat. Along the creeks, canoes were already out, one person paddling in the stern and another in the bow with a line, working the shaded banks where the fish lay. In the villages, smoke came up from cooking fires, and the sound of a hand-cranked, mill-grating maniac carried across the water. Somewhere, a rubber tapper who had left his house at 4 had already finished half his circuit and was working the last of it in the light, cutting a fresh sliver of bark below the old scar on each tree and setting the cup. Children in white shirts were being ferried to school. On the forest floor, the leaf-cutter columns that had been running all night were still running. Though they would thin out as the sun climbed, and the workers carrying leaves toward the nest would be shadowed by the small ones riding on the fragments to fend off parasitic flies. In the crowds, the mixed flocks were assembling and beginning their sweep. Out on a red clay bluff above a western tributary, the parakeets were coming down first, as they always did, testing the ground before the macaws would risk it, and the trees above the lick were filling with birds waiting for someone else to go first. By 9 o'clock, the character of the forest had changed completely from what it had been 4 hours earlier. The birds had largely finished and gone quiet. The cicadas had taken over, and their sound was a high, hard, pulsing shrill that filled the whole day and was so constant that visitors stopped hearing it by the second morning. The light was vertical and merciless in the open and entirely absent under the trees. Butterflies came down to the damp sand at the edges of the streams and gathered there in crowds to drink, sometimes dozens together, opening and closing, blue and yellow and orange. The heat pressed down. Everything with any sense found shade, and the sloth in its fork of a tree adjusted its position by perhaps 10 centimeters and settled again, and the caiman lay in the shallows with only its eyes and nostrils showing, and the forest arrived at the drowsy, motionless, ringing stillness of a tropical midday, in which the loudest thing for hours would be a single, falling fruit. And by mid-afternoon, the clouds would have piled up again into their white towers, and by 4, the base of them would have gone the color of slate, and the wind would drop, and the gray curtain would come across the water with its hard leading edge, and it would all begin again. That was the shape of it, and it had been the shape of it for a very long time. And it required nothing at all from anyone. The river went on carrying its billion tons of mountain toward the sea. The trees went on breathing out their several hundred liters apiece and building the rain that would fall on them the following week. The fish went on drifting downstream as larvae and swimming back as adults. The flood came up into the trees and went down again. The lull came at 3 in the morning, and the tinamou called at 4:30, and none of it was waiting on anybody's attention, which is a good thought to be left with at the end of a long list, in the dark, with nothing further required. The facts have all been told, and there is no need to hold on to any of them. They will still be true tomorrow, whether or not a single one is remembered. The counting is over. The lamp is out. The river is moving somewhere a very long way from here, patiently in the dark, under a canopy full of sleeping birds and a sky with 2 hemispheres of stars in it, and it will still be moving in the morning, and there is nothing whatever that needs doing about it now. Rest easy. Let the breathing slow. Let the sounds of that forest, the drip and the distant water, and the soft, irregular tapping of rain finding its way down through 40 meters of leaves, carry on quietly at the edge of hearing for as long as they are useful, and then let them go too, and sleep well.